and we think the punks are involved. Already, she was realising, this would contradict her advice to Aidan about keeping his eye on the main game and leaving peripheral offences to the regular policing system. "You could, yes, Williams, you could do that. Tell him to look out for anyone with a special interest in matches." Macready stood up. Though on second thoughts, it would be better for Latham to provide him with that advice, and please be assured that everything about this inquiry has my personal supervision by agreement with your chief superintendent. Silvera's colleagues are to be informed that he has been transferred again to assist with a special inquiry at Notting Hill. Latham will maintain daily contact with him while he is under cover. Does that address all your concerns? No, sir, she thought. Yes, sir, she said. Chapter 20. Still in her jeans, Bryony laid out her new clothes on the bed, intending to put them on just before she went out. Since she wasn't due to meet Gareth till 10, she'd left her packing for the morning. Better do it all in one hit, rather than risk leaving those last-minute essentials behind, like the toothbrush and the hairbrush and the moisturiser, and of course mustn't forget her pills. That would be a truly daft thing to do mid-cycle. She was heading for the bathroom to collect all this, when the phone rang. Gareth? Surely he would be on the train by now. What if he'd missed it? She dived for the phone. Sorry, I know you're on holiday, strictly speaking. I'm about to leave, literally, Steve. I've got a train to meet. Aha! Who's on that train, Bryony? That's the thing. Gareth, is it? The two men had met in Oxford a couple of years ago, when the early stages of her relationship with Gareth got wired into the investigation of an especially nasty case. Macready had brought Steve into that one too, because of his particular qualifications, which of course licensed him to pass an expert opinion on Gareth. She remembered it word for word. A permanent amateur, Bryony. Nice but fuzzy round the edges. You'll get bored with him. So far, that had been proved wrong on every count. Yes, she sighed into the receiver. Gareth. I'll be away for a couple of weeks, Steve. I'll phone you when I get back to see how things are going. Aidan starts at the weekend, is that right? Yes. We got Jimmy Chapman to fix him up with some accommodation and equipment. But that's not why I called you. Look, I'm sorry this is rather last minute, but I only just heard you'd brought your holiday plans forward. While you're away from your flat, we think it's best if you leave a spare key with us. I've only got one key. Could you leave it at the station before you go? Is this really necessary? Yes. I've been talking to Bevan. According to him, the forensics on my flat point to a series of intrusions. In other words, it looks as if someone got in a couple of times to do a bit of recce before the arson attack. How did they get in, Steve? You told me Macready's place was burglar-proofed. I'm afraid to say that the explanation is the bleeding obvious. Bathroom window, she cut in. The bleeding obvious with a twist, I was about to say. In both cases, it's a fixed window with a small flap above that opens outwards. Supposed to be too small for human access. 6 inches by 15. So there's a kid involved. No, Bryony, let me get the story out, will you? You might actually learn something. This was a sophisticated operation. Somebody slid through those windows. Suckos found traces of Vaseline around the edges and through the interior, but no fingerprints. Vaseline and rubber gloves. Maybe he's got a latex suit. Are we dealing with the human condom? Well, they are into leather and rubberware down that end of town. Look, Steve, I've really got to go. I'll drop the key off at Chelsea on my way to Victoria Station and hope that someone will fix my bathroom window before I get back. She put the phone down and glanced at her watch. The little shoe repair place on the corner had a key-cutting service. If she whipped down there now, they might be able to do it straight away. Then she'd have to do her packing at the double, allowing for the detour via Chelsea. She should still be on time to meet Gareth. Promise you won't be late, he'd said on the phone several times. It was a pretty tight margin for their connection to Birmingham, and if they missed that, they'd miss the only connection to Aberystwyth. Damn! There was an elderly man standing at the counter, having a very involved conversation with the assistant about the cost of repairing a pair of black shoes that looked as if they'd been around for at least a decade. There was no one else to serve her, so she had to wait. 2, 3, 4 minutes. She managed to return the old guy's friendly smile as he finally left. "How long does it take you to cut a key?" she asked. "I'm in a hurry." "Well," said the portly assistant, smoothing the thin veil of hair over his scalp, "in a normal course of things, a couple of minutes, but I can't guarantee because I'm on my own this morning, so I've got the shop to look after. I'll do my best." He took the key and squinted at it, then began setting up the job in a sequence of slow, heavy movements. Bryony willed the shop door to stay shut. Thoughts raced through her head to the noise of the cutting machine. What if someone really had been in her flat, or was planning to get in? Perhaps she'd been tailed as she went between home and work, and the intruder now knew all kinds of things about her. "Don't get paranoid," she instructed herself. It was vital in this business to know how to separate imagined threats from an alertness to real danger, though sometimes that wasn't easy. She looked at her watch again, and again. With the 2 keys clutched in her hand, she sprinted back to the flat, making decisions as she went. She'd call the taxi as soon as she got in, then do a quick pack while she was waiting for it. No time to change into her new clothes now. In any case, wearing a short skirt and espadrilles when you were lugging a bulging hold-all around was a daffy thing to do. She tried the new key, improbably shiny and still warm, in the door. Unaccustomed as she was to taking cabs, she knew that calling one, when you needed it, really quickly, was a situation guaranteed to invoke Murphy's Law. She looked out of the window and checked the traffic down the high street. It was flowing okay, but there were only 2 taxis in sight, and both of them were engaged. "Ready to go now, love?" said the operator. "Pretty well," she replied, with one eye on the mess of clothes littering the bed. She threw the piles of underwear and the change of jeans into the bottom of the hold-all, placed the espadrilles at the ends, with her rolled-up towel and swimsuit between them, and was just folding the skirt and blouse into the remaining space at the top when the doorbell rang. Shit! She zipped up the bag and foraged in the drawer for paper and an envelope. She scribbled a brief note to Chief Inspector Fletcher, folded it around the key, slipped it into the envelope, and then into her handbag. After a quick check for the train tickets, she grabbed the hold-all and left. "Off on your holidays?" asked the cabbie brightly. As she settled herself in the back, a wave of relief swept over her, and she actually began to feel quite excited. The driver leant his head back in the way they did when they wanted to talk to you. "Sunny Spain, is it?" She laughed. "Not quite. Aberystwyth." "Oh, yes. Change at Birmingham, if I remember rightly. But that's Euston, innit? You sure it's Victoria Station you want?" "I don't think you can go from Victoria to Birmingham." "I'm meeting someone there. We're getting the tube to Euston." "A pretty special someone, I suspect." He tapped the side of his nose. "Getting you racing all across London like this?" She laughed again, enjoying the banter. "Actually, it was my idea. He's coming from Paris. I wanted to be there when he arrived." "Better make sure you aren't late then, aren't we? What time's his train due in?" 10:05, but actually I have to drop something off on the way. Can you go via Lucan Place, off the Fulham Road?" "I know where Lucan Place is. It's where they have the cop shop, isn't it?" "I work there." "No kidding. You don't look like the Miss Plod type to me. Seems a shame you have to go to work when you're just off on your holidays." "As I said, I'm just dropping something off. It won't take me a few seconds." She was as good as her word. "Mission accomplished," she announced, bouncing back into the cab as a second wave of relief and elation took over. At last she was really on her way. The cabbie chattered on as they drove around Sloane Square and pulled up outside Victoria Station at 3 minutes past 10, handsomely earning the 50p tip Bryony had ready. "I'd say you've timed that nicely," he said, making a mock salute as he deposited her suitcase on the pavement. "Even if you were in a bit of a rush. Hope you remembered to pack your toothbrush." Bryony stood, suitcase in hand, as the blood rushed to her face. Oh, sugar puss. If only the toothbrush was all she'd forgotten to pack. Chapter 21. Riding down the King's Road on the Vespa, with a guitar slung on his back, Aidan passed a police car, whose occupants showed no sign of recognising him, though he recognised them easily enough. They were both officers he'd seen around at Lucan Place. So what did that prove? He smiled to himself and raised a hand in greeting to the little group of people hanging around outside Sex. 2 hands were raised in return. People knew their own tribe, didn't they? He turned into Gunter Grove and scanned the housing on either side. There were a couple of blocks of hideous red brick flats, but beyond those it was mostly terraces, squashed up tight and displaying an assortment of flaking paint colours. The number he was looking for was about halfway up on the left. There was no doorbell, so he did a rat-a-tat with his knuckles. "Nick, I'm Jimmy." Jimmy Chapman held the door wide. "Go on up." The spongy nylon carpet grabbed at the soles of his shoes as he climbed the stairs. Jimmy followed, talking all the time. "Kitchen's at the top there, straight ahead of you. Bathroom on the left. There's nobody else living here right now. The downstairs has all been ripped out for refurbishment. Your room's the door on the right." The room was a reasonable size, with a window facing over the street. Aidan propped the guitar against the bed and stood with his thumbs hooked into his pockets, taking it in. Wooden chair, wardrobe, and a table under the window with the phone on it. All up, functional and adequate. "I doubt I'll need that," he said, pointing to the wardrobe. "Oh, yes, you will. You'll want somewhere to store all the bits of evidence you collect, won't you? Here." Jimmy held out a bunch of keys, dangling it on the end of a finger. "Front door key, key to the door of your room, and the wardrobe key. We've had the lock reinforced specially. There's a duplicate set with the Socko team." "Nice to know they're taking care of my privacy." "Privacy?" Jimmy laughed. "You can forget your privacy. It's not what undercover work's about." "So I'm learning. You done it yourself then, going undercover?" "A couple of times. They asked me to do more, but I've got a growing family, see? They like me to come home for dinner." "And that's why you left the police?" "More or less." "You were on the Socko team, right? That's what Doc Latham told me. Photographer. So how come you're getting yourself involved in this situation?" "Ah." Jimmy perched on the edge of the table. "Long story, really. Tell you one day. Suffice to say, I used to do a lot of work with Macready, and he calls me in from time to ask for an odd favour. Now, open that wardrobe, would you?" Aidan did so, and found a leather jacket hanging inside. "One surprise after another." He pulled it out. "What else has Father Christmas brought me?" "Put it on." "It's heavy." "Put the bugger on, will you? Now, the real Christmas present is what you'll find in the right inside pocket." "I thought somebody'd left their fags in here," said Aidan, extracting a black metal object the size of a cigarette packet. "What's this?" "You'll have to give it back, mind." "I'm asking what it is." Jimmy took the thing from him and held it lovingly on the outstretched palm of his hand. "Must say, I wouldn't mind one of these. The Minox EL, what a little beauty." He flipped the top open, and a metal cone emerged. A camera lens. Now the 2 men were standing shoulder to shoulder, peering closely at it. Jimmy went through the functions with a rapid professional spiel. Film and battery compartments, focus, flash, winder. "You're being issued with a dozen bulbs to start with," he said, "so don't get too flash happy. You wouldn't want to know what they cost. And here's your rolls of film and your replacement batteries. Camera stays in your pocket at all times, with its little drawbridge shut to protect the lens. Brilliant, that is. And the other tackle you keep here." He grasped the hem of the jacket and gave it a downwards tug. "Now, Just let me have a look. Jimmy crouched, so Aidan's groin was at eye level.
Hey, man, what kind of tackle you talking about?
There's an inside zipper. Oh, yes, here it is. He stood up. All you have to do is push the batteries through one by one. That's right. And they just sit in that little tube at the bottom of the lining. Same with the flash bulbs and film. Then when you need them, you just squeeze them out. Aidan was following the instructions, but he came to a halt.
Hang on, there's already some shit in here.
He was feeling around the back of the jacket.
No wonder it's heavy. Somebody's been hiding the kitchen cutlery.
I just put in a few useful bits and pieces. Screwdriver, penknife, wire for picking locks and other emergency purposes. Torch, nice little pen light.
So, that's my Christmas stocking, is it?
I drew the line at the tangerine. Sit down a minute, will you? There's a few more instructions.
Aidan rolled his eyes. Instructions. Oh, there would be.
The jacket. Jimmy perched on the edge of the table again. You're to wear the jacket at all times, even when you're sweating like a pig, which you will be in some of those concert places they go to. Safety reasons. The lining's reinforced for extra protection against razor slashes, or if anybody happens to get you up against a brick wall and start trying to punch your liver apart. Or, for that matter, if you come off that shonky little thing you got parked outside. Now, where was I? Oh, yes, photographs. You'll find the Minox very discreet. I've tried it out. Once you get the hang of it, you can snap away with the camera in your hand like this.
Jimmy held his palm at waist height.
No one will twig that's what you're actually doing. Of course, it'll be hit and miss at first, but after a while you'll get eyes in your hands. Then you bring the film to me. The shop's easy to find. Snap Happy, just around the corner on your left in the Fulham Road. You need to check in with me every few days in case I've got messages for you.
I already got to check in with Doc Latham.
McCrady's the belt and braces man. He wants you to check in with me as well. And if things start getting ugly, you can come round and take a bit of a breather, even if it's after hours. We live above the shop, so I'm always about. All right then, all set.
Aidan was sitting with his elbows on the table, rotating one of the studs in his ear. You're talking like it's a race, man.
Well, you better be prepared, because it can turn out that way.
After Jimmy had gone, Aidan took another look at the camera and tried a couple of shots, aiming through the window with the thing held against his hip and watching himself in the wardrobe mirror. No, you'd never notice he was taking a photo if he could get the knack of doing it that way. The shutter was quiet, but not silent. He turned and looked at the room. A little dead place. You could go mad on your own in a room like this. He grabbed the keys and left.
How on earth do you get into them? Asked Sharon, staring at the rubber trousers. Easy, said Zig. You just need some of this. She held up a large tin of baby powder, exactly like the one Sharon was used to seeing beside Debbie's cot. Zig twisted the top and shook a generous amount into each of the rubber cylinders that formed the legs of the trousers. Go on, try. Hesitantly, Sharon put one foot in. It slid right through and came out the other end. Hey! She shouted, and followed up with the other foot. They're all sort of slippery. What's this on the outside of them? It's just Vaseline. Gives them a wet look. You sure you don't want them? I've already got some, said Zig. They're expensive, though, aren't they? Doesn't he want any money for them? Apparently not. Flack doesn't care about money. I don't know why he bought these in the first place. They're not his sort of thing. Sharon smoothed her hands over the shiny contours of her hips. OK, then. Thanks. But I feel a bit funny about it. I mean, I've seen the price tags on these up in sex. 40 quid. You sure he's not after something? Flack's always after something. But fortunately, it's not me anymore. Do you trust him, though? Zig snorted loudly. You're obsessed with trust, Sharon. It's a stupid middle-class word. Well, that's a change. Nobody ever told me off for being middle-class before, but let's not change the subject. Flack knows something about Sol for sure. Can't you even see that? Zig was concentrating hard on lighting a fag.
her hands cupped around the match in a way that wasn't necessary indoors on a warm day. Eventually she surfaced, shaking the match and exhaling with exaggerated force.
I wasn't born yesterday. It's just you've got to tread carefully where Flack's concerned. He's the type that's got a finger in every pie. If he's done something to Sol, I'll find out about it. Don't you worry, and I'll get him for it.
What do you mean, done something to him? Zig's face was turned away, towards the window. She dragged on the cigarette again, then rubbed the back of her hand across her forehead, sniffing audibly. Sharon knew she was crying, and tactfully went out of the room, trying to prevent the trousers from squeaking as she moved. She would have to find a way to help. She really would. It was cooling outside, and the light had lost its glare. But there would be another 3 hours to go till dark, Aidan figured, so he might as well make use of them. Having only just started with BD, he didn't know the area that well, and in any case, there were all sorts of things you missed when you were at the wheel of a police car. He was in the mood for a freewheeling cruise. London had its own way of keeping its worlds apart. The warren of the old World's End streets ran immediately behind the main road, but wasn't visible from it. You had to go behind a block of glass-fronted offices before you even got a plain view of the flats that had been built at the eastern end of the estate. Aidan decided to start at the western end, where he stopped to explore the confused intersection of the creek and the railway line. The Chelsea Creek ran through into the fenced precinct of the power station, where it cut between two massive faceless buildings, one brick, one concrete, joined by an iron bridge. He stopped again to stare at the 15-foot-high wire gate, with its jabbering mess of yellow and orange notices. Keep out. Restricted area. Warning. Danger. Hazardous materials. Beware. As if one of them wasn't enough to get the point across. You! A rasping voice yelled from behind him. He turned to see two boys, little kids in short pants and ragged plimsolls, sitting on the wall bordering the railway line.
You're a spiker, ain't ya?
Aidan folded his arms and stared back. One of the boys, an anaemic-looking character with orange hair and ears stuck out at right angles, jumped down from the wall and stood facing him on the pavement opposite. A car passed on the narrow road between them.
You're a spiker,
the kid repeated, in a not unfriendly way. What gives you that idea? Aidan smiled.
Don't they have black spikers then?
If I knew what a spiker was, I might be able to tell you that. The boy crossed the road.
If you go down there, you'll see.
He pointed along Lott's Road.
That's where they live.
What you talking about, man?
Spikers. People that put spikes in their hair.
The kid demonstrated, twisting the front of his hair into peaks.
One of them give me this.
He fished in his pocket and pulled out a ball of lumpy yellow stuff.
Rubber.
Very nice. Aidan gave it a poke. That's dead useful, that is. I'll see you later, then. He got back on the scooter and turned into Lott's Road, smiling to himself and keeping an eye out for spikers, but there were none in sight. He turned back out onto the King's Road, which at this time of the early evening was a parade ground where the striped and capped regiments from the fashion world were changing guard with the more feral contingents of punks, Teds and local drinkers, all priming themselves for the Friday night fight that would get underway in a few hours' time. He didn't plan on being around for that, but there was enough time for a pint or two, and hopefully a plate of pub food. Sighting a little group of spikers, 2 girls and a boy, going into the Man in the Moon, he followed and joined them at the bar, simply behaving as if they already knew each other. It worked, though there wasn't much value in it from Aidan's point of view. They were kids who had yet to learn how to make conversation, so they made remarks instead, disconnected and increasingly incoherent as they succumbed to the combination of beer and pills they were swilling down. He asked about Flack and was told that he didn't come in here because he'd been banned for jumping over the bar into a shelf of expensive liqueurs. Aidan found his attention drawn to a table near the back where two very ill-assorted people were in earnest conversation. One of them had immediately caught Aidan's attention with his half-shaved head and swastika tattoo just above the right ear. The letters SS were studded into his leather waistcoat, along with an assortment of badges that Aidan recognised from war movies with Nazis in them. His companion was a man who looked about a decade older and whose style belonged to a different world, all blue denim with a cap to match. The denim dude was writing in a notebook. Suddenly, the one in the Nazi regalia got up and left, knocking over his chair on the way out. Aidan watched, curious that the denim guy hardly reacted at all, but went on writing in his notebook. After a while, he made his way over to the bar. Aidan drained his glass and moved to stand beside him. It took a while for either of them to get served, and the man looked at his watch twice.
"In a hurry, are you?"
Aidan asked. "No, as a matter of fact." The man smiled broadly, evidently pleased to be drawn into a chat. "Just I'm not used to the kind of service you get in these parts." He spoke in an American accent. "I haven't seen you in here before." Aidan shrugged.
"Trying a new beat, you know."
There was a pause while they got their drinks, and Aidan could see the guy was checking him over, no doubt trying to suss out where he belonged in the scheme of things. He wasn't going to have to work hard to get some dialogue going here anyway. The American took a swig from his lager bottle with one hand and held out the other in greeting.
"I'm Logan."
"Nick," said Aidan, giving the hand a cursory shake. "Now what's your line, Nick? I'd pick you for a musician. Am I right?"
"And I'd pick you for a journalist," thought Aidan, a mile off.
He nodded and followed Logan to the table he'd colonised. "Vocals?" Logan pulled a chair out for him. "Guitar?"
"Bit of both. Know anyone that's short of a band member?"
"What sort of band you looking for, Nick?"
"I used to be in a reggae band, but I got bored. I'm more interested in this new wave that's happening."
"Punk," Logan prompted. "You know they pinched that word from us. Name of a magazine started up last year by a couple of high school kids in Connecticut. I used to write for it, before I got me a regular column in Beaten Tracks. So you see, I know a bit of history on the so-called new wave. It ain't so new. Most of it started with the Ramones. A lot of this image stuff, it's pinched from Andy Warhol. You know who Andy Warhol is, Nick?"
"I'm not going there, man. Yellow hair isn't my thing."
Logan gave the laugh of a man with no real sense of humour. "What about swastikas? They your type of thing?" Aidan drank some more and took his time replying.
"I saw you with the SS man. Looked like he got a bit riled, flouncing out like that."
Logan gave him a knowing look. "Oh, yeah, he's right on the edge, that one. Got himself in a role without reading the script. I guess he liked the costume." Chapter 22. Sharon lifted the sleeping cat off the heap of clothes in the corner and began raking through them, looking for something she could wear to the concert tonight. The rubber trousers were too hot, and the tartan skirt, her favourite, had yellow smears all down the front. Not that she minded the look of it, but it had occurred to her that whoever was coming and going in that workshop downstairs might not be too pleased if they knew she'd got in there, which they'd realise instantly if they saw her wearing the traces of the accident with the paint. She'd noticed that Zig hadn't worn her rubber vest since then, either, although she claimed she really liked the yellow splash across the chest. Maybe she'd had the same thought about being found out, but somehow neither of them was prepared to talk about it. Zig had been going off on her own a lot over the past week, so they really only saw each other back at the squat at night, when there were other people partying all over the furniture. Right now, Sharon was enjoying having the place to herself for a few hours. She tossed the clothes around, picking out the remains of her school uniform and doing some extra work on them with a pair of long-bladed scissors. The shredded strands of fabric down the sides could be knotted to make criss-cross panels, which was a nice effect, she decided, though she'd need to wear something under it. At the bottom of the heap was a collection of old petticoat slips, of the kind she'd always been embarrassed to see on other people's washing lines. Pink things with ribbons and straps and lace edging. She tried one on with the uniform over the top and went through to the mattress room to check it in the mirror. The cat ran ahead of her, but diverted its course to shoot down the stairs. The mirror was on the inside of the wardrobe door, which was always stuck fast, so you had to brace the whole wardrobe with one hand while you tugged at the handle with the other. As the mirror image swung in front of her eyes, Sharon registered something that wasn't right. There were two people in there, herself and a man she hadn't seen before, who met her eye in the reflection. She froze, staring back. The man had wavy fair hair, and his face seemed to glow against the fur of the cat, which he held on his shoulder. Aidan pushed his way out through the door of the triangle, dodging a flying bottle that was thrown from the stage. The floor was covered with broken glass, and some of the people at the back of the hall were scraping it together with their feet to make piles, then jumping on it to see who could make the loudest crunch. One of them had cut himself right through the sole of his canvas shoe and was marching around showing off his gory footprints. It was the amphetamines. Everyone was behaving like naughty little kids at a birthday party. Well, it hadn't been much of a concert, even by their standards. The Suddens failed to show up. The crunch played so fast they shot through in 10 minutes, and that left the knackers with too much time, so they started repeating songs that weren't worth performing in the first place. And there was no one selling fanzines, so from Aidan's point of view it was all a bit of a waste of time. He sat on the wall by the petrol station, watching the crowd oozing out onto the street. Like all crowds, it was a collection of smaller units that reformed themselves as the main mass broke up. Funny how for all their advertised love of sex and kinky gear, the tribe gravitated into little safety cliques, just like any other clump of teenagers, girls with girls and boys with boys. Now he'd been in amongst them for a week, Aidan was able to recognise a fair number of these cliques. The ones that liked promenading down the King's Road in the afternoons were mainly the art students and experimentalists, linked into the new alternative fashion trade that was developing its own unofficial star system focused on the shop at number 430. Then there were the World's End locals, who didn't go in so much for display games and look-at-me outfits. They were a more mixed bunch that included Indians and Pakis, Africans and West Indians, but few girls. The local contingents drifted between the music shops, the working men's pubs, and the punk meeting grounds. Then there were the skinheads and cosh boys, who often came in from other parts of the city, sniffing around for a fight. It hadn't been difficult to identify Flack, because he tacked between these contingents, pulling focus and dominating the conversation in all of them. So far, Aidan hadn't approached him. It was tricky, because he could tell from the glances thrown in his direction that Flack had registered him as a new presence, and the sizing up was mutual. Aidan figured that if he hung around in the right places, sooner or later, Flack would make the approach, and that would work a whole lot better. But this hadn't turned out to be the right place. Not tonight. He started walking up the King's Road, hoping at least for a few more lights and a bit more action, before beating a retreat to the hutch in Gunter Grove. If the action was missing from the triangle tonight, it must have gone somewhere else. But where? As he approached Sex, Aidan saw that the place was lit inside, and the door was open. Some people were just leaving, so he slowed to see who came out. 4 men and the girl with the beehive hairdo, who stopped to lock up. One of the men separated from the group and crossed the road. Logan. Well, Logan was a journalist, and journalists were supposed to find things out, weren't they? That put the two of them in the same boat, really. He crossed after him and caught up.
Hey, Logan. How's it going? We met at the Man in the Moon, remember?
Oh, yeah, Nick. How are you?
Not too thrilled. Just been down there.
He gestured back towards the triangle.
Concert. It was a tragedy, man. Mainline act didn't show up for work.
Don't tell me, the Suddens. They're making a habit of the no-show. Logan began to count on his fingers. The Nashville, Marquee, even the 100 Club. Playing hard to get.
Yeah?
Aidan stuck his hands in his pockets.
How hard do you have to play that game before anyone just lets them drop off into nowhere land?
You seen one of their acts yet? I don't know where those guys are headed, but it's somewhere, I can tell you that. Somewhere with a capital S. But I doubt it's anywhere any normal folks would want to be. I was sent over from New York to see what they do, and when I report back, no one's going to believe me.
So what is it they're not going to believe?
The atmosphere those hoodoos generate. Logan shook his head. Heavy, heavy, heavy. Everybody's angry around here, you know? But it's like the Suddens go beyond anger. There's something not even human about the energy they put out. The fact you can't see their faces, that's part of it, of course. You know, I'm starting to get the inside story there. I found out who makes those faces. Quite a little story in itself.
Yeah?
Now, don't try and get me to spill, Nick, because I got an important career move happening here. But if you're lucky, I'll give you a copy of my piece when I've written it. You still trying to get in on a band?
Not any of them bands I heard tonight. Suddens or the Pistols the only outfits worth getting into. I've been looking to have a word with Flack.
I could tell you where you might find him, if you really want to put yourself in the way of some trouble. I'm sure there's plenty of kids want to get into that band, but I know one that wants out.
The pantomime Nazi?
Actually, I'm supposed to protect my sources. Logan's tone had changed, especially when they're shit scared. Just bear that in mind if you find yourself getting an entry pass to Senior Flack's fun park. I'm told he likes to hand him out from time to time.
Sorry?
Aidan frowned in exaggerated puzzlement.
You lost me there.
Logan was silent for a while as they crossed Beaufort Street and walked on towards the town hall.
Where are we going exactly?
Asked Aidan. Little place up here that stays open real late. I go there pretty regular, and I've seen Flack in amongst it. Not his type of place, you might think, but I seen him in there more than a couple of times. Logan stopped and turned to face him. Okay, this much I'll let on, Nick. Seeing you look like a nice guy. The Suddens have a few regular members. Let's say 3. He held up his hands, palms out. Now, don't ask me about that, because I'm not about to tell you what I know and what I don't know. The point is, they use extras, ring-ins, to be part of the act sometimes. You can do your own figuring out about who told me that bit of the story, but it fits with something else I learned. Flack used to be in vaudeville. Music hall, I think they call it here in the UK, doing magic acts. You probably know they always call up an audience member to be a witness in those types of acts, and I'm guessing that's part of the idea. Flack's a real professional show-off. He likes to make sure he does what he does right under people's noses, and he's pretty damn good at making sure they only see what he wants them to see. If they happen to see anything he doesn't want them to see, they're in big trouble. You with me? Anyway, that's about what I got to say, because where I'm going is just around the corner there in Garrett Street, little nightclub. If you want to come, that's up to you. Aidan's acquaintance with the area was only recent, but he knew the location of most of the pubs and clubs from a map stuck up on the wall in the CID room. The Garrett Street dive was called the Hot Stepper and featured strip acts. A panda car sailed past and turned the corner ahead of them. "Hope they're not going to spoil the party," said Logan. "It's kind of cute down there when the girls get warmed up. You know, I like to go somewhere a bit different this time of night. I like to get in the comfort zone, leave the wildlife and the world's end to do their worst in the dark hours. I can think of better company than a bunch of ferrets when it gets near my bedtime. Logan's talk was drowned out by the growing volume of the music as they neared the entrance to the hot stepper. He led the way down the stairs into a basement area, with tables set out on a black and silver floor. In the centre was a round stage, raised a couple of feet above the ground and just big enough for one dancer to do her stuff. Right now, it was occupied by a girl wearing a short, glossy scarlet wig, silver high heels, and nothing else but a lot of glitter sprayed on densely around the pubic area. She pulsed with the beat coming through the amplifiers, bending deep, arching and pouting, flicking her tongue. The two men sat, drinking steadily and staring at the lit circle beside them as a succession of girls in different wigs and shoes performed more or less the same routine. Aidan made his drink last longer than he wanted, but otherwise gave himself up to the situation, due compensation for the punishment all his senses had taken in the earlier part of the evening. He didn't even notice the guy sitting at the table on the other side of the dancer's platform, or register his approach. In one of the short intervals between the acts, Flack had made his way over and was standing behind Logan, staring at Aidan. Logan turned, following the direction of Aidan's gaze.
"Hey, what do you know?"
He pulled out a chair.
"Hope you're enjoying the entertainment, Signor."
"I like the one with the snakes, but she's on tonight, so I'm getting bored." Flack looked at Aidan again. "You have a way of turning up, don't you?"
Yeah. Well.
Aidan sat back in his chair and held the eye contact.
Matter of fact, I turned up at the Triangle, but you didn't.
Logan gave Aidan a matey smack on the shoulder.
"Nick's on the lookout for a good gig, aren't you, Nick?" "What did you say you do? Vocals?"
"Is that so?" Flack's eyes remained dead, but the lower half of his face developed a crooked smile.
"Ah, lovely."
The music started again, and it was evident from the added razzmatazz and build-up that the next act was the finale. The girl appeared wearing a floor-length black cloak with a silver lining, from which she produced 3 short sticks. After getting selected punters to light them for her, she threw off the cloak and began to juggle with them, faster and faster, till they formed a wheel of flame that spun around her naked body like a hoop. To finish, she extinguished the flaming batons one by one in her mouth. Flack yawned ostentatiously through the applause. "Shite," he commented as she made her exit in a swirl of black and silver.
"Seemed pretty impressive to me."
Logan was beaming all over his face.
"What are you drinking?"
Black Label was Flack's poison. Aidan decided to copy him, since admission to the tribe often depended on such things. He should have known better. "Black Label for you, Black Label for me. Stirring up the racial harmony. You know the best way to achieve that. Burn each other's faces off. How do you think that'd go down in this sweet little place?" Flack was grinning. Aidan took a swig of his drink, but offered no comeback. "Thing is," Flack continued, "how do they keep the tick on their licensing arrangement when they're doing that stuff? You know what? They told me they'll close the show down at the Triangle if I like so much as a sodding match. I found that seriously annoying. So I told them to sod off. We got the best fire show in London, and nowhere to roll it out, except Highgate Cemetery."
"You're doing a gig in Highgate?"
"Any day now. Keep your ears open. The word will get round. But what we need is an indoor venue. So what I'm thinking is, why don't we move into here? That'd wake the place up a bit, wouldn't it? He looked around, ostentatiously craning his scrawny neck.
This could be quite a gratifying audience for the Suddens. I mean, look at them. The kipper ties and two-tone shoes brigade. Just my sort of clientele. The men of the future. Do you ever think about that? England's future. Do you? What did you say your name was?
Nick.
Where you from, Nick? Jamaica? There used to be a joke about that. My girlfriend works in a strip joint. Jamaica? That's the kind of joke I was brought up on, which explains a lot, really, about this brain-dead country, I mean. So tell me, where do you come from?
Aidan kept his face nice and straight. Not in ill. Flack sucked in his breath dramatically.
Nasty. Trouble brewing there. Cops to the one side of you, National Front to the other, and White Riot gearing up to cut through the middle. No more fun up that way, mate, believe me. You a Rasta?
Aidan broke into a wide grin. Well, kill me dead. How'd you come to a conclusion like that, man?
What's your act, then?
Depends what the people want. You want Rasta, I can do Rasta. Next year, mind, is 1977. Aidan wagged a finger. Apocalypse happening. So it's all going to be Skaderman crowflies. I do vocals and guitar. I'll do your demo any time.
People have a habit of saying that to me,
Flack responded lazily.
Even the birds around here.
As Logan returned with the drinks, Flack swivelled round to address him.
You know, when you told me you liked to hang out in this place, I thought you must be joking. That was my original conclusion. I never seen anything so piss-weak as that last little demonstration.
Well, seems you like it too. There was an edge of sleaze in Logan's smile. He'd had too much to drink and was way off his guard. Aidan felt distinctly uncomfortable for the guy as he expanded back into his chair, barely drawing the line at a nudge-nudge, wink-wink as he went on. It's not about their pyrotechnic skills, man. He drew curvy lines in the air, then raised his whiskey glass in salute before drinking.
That cloak,
said Flack, raising the volume to public address level again,
is a dead giveaway. It's a fire blanket, see? No genuine flamer would include a fire blanket in the act.
I bet you'd like to teach her a thing or two, said Logan. Chapter 23. It was 1 o'clock by the time Logan made his exit from the hot stepper, and all the available girls had gone. But somehow he didn't feel quite ready to call it quits. He was getting used to the nocturnal lifestyle in these parts, where this was peak hour and the day generally ended somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning. As he approached the Cloisters, the mangy apartment block where he'd taken a 3-month lease, there were lights on in the upper floors. This was the time when the dealers did their rounds, and the kids who'd managed to lay their hands on some cash graduated from amphetamine pills to the serious stuff. Of course, the same thing happened in parts of New York and San Francisco, but there was a different kind of vibe here, a level of anger that was toxic. Logan decided to write his weekly column immediately, while Flack's talk was buzzing in his head. Someone needed to ring the alarm bells about the Suddens, and if the British music press were too blind to see what was going on under their noses, why not go for a scoop? He sat at his desk and uncovered the typewriter. Here in London, they're not used to the summer. It only hits them once in 5 years or so, and when it does, they go apeshit. They call it the dog days, and there's a lot of snarling and yelping happening around the music scene. All that pent-up craziness the Brits normally keep behind closed doors is spilling out on the King's Road. It's a brain fever festival, free for all, and especially the most talentless. Talent is out of style here. Style means ripped gear held together with safety pins, and the one that yells loudest gets to hold the mic. The sensation groups of the season are the Sex Pistols, the Clash, and Sudden Death. But it's the suddens you want to watch out for. Believe me, the suddens are coming. But what are they coming with? Well, for a start, crazy faces. On stage, they wear leather hoods with zips across the mouth, or rubber Halloween masks created by some guy in a basement who thinks he's William Blake. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night. Yes, that William Blake, the one who wanted to build the holy city on England's green and pleasant land. Lyricist and lead stuntman Flack, a.k.a. Gary Flaxman, of Sudden Death, has a different agenda. Bam, bam, bam to this bam nation. Bam, bam, bam to this abomination. I am the spokesman for the UK. I sharpened up my spoke, and this is what I say. Bam, 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 stick it up. Stick it up the UK, where the morons all come out to play, where the bottom kills you every day. Stick your spoke in the wheel, turn your future into something real. Sudden death is your best friend when you live in this FUKing pleasant land. It kinda sets your teeth on edge when you hear them belt this stuff out through a distorting amplifier with black leather masks over their heads. I don't know about the morons, but I tell you, right here it's a playground for swastika-wearing anarchists and kids who think Charlie Manson and Max the Walker Tremblay are heroes of a dawning age. Sure looks different from the age of Aquarius. The cult of the Suddens is promoted in a new fanzine called Yella, where you can see the future slashed with razors, stuck with pins, and bound in chains. Logan flexed his fingers and stretched back in his chair. He felt good. He'd never written a piece so fast. According to his watch, it was just shy of 2. 400 words in 45 minutes. If he could make this his batting average, he'd be able to multiply his commissions. Maybe get on a payroll at one of the bigger magazines that paid decent accommodation expenses. The Scoop would do it. But he needed something more to go on than Kaiser's ravings. His 400-word limit had run out before he got started on the stuff about the Highgate concerts. Okay, so that was for his next column, where he was going to nail the story. Logan stretched again and decided it was time for bed. Aidan stood in the middle of the room, hands plunged in his jacket pockets, wondering what to do with himself. Right now, it was a strictly physical problem. The choices were: sit in the wooden chair by the wooden table, lie on the metal bed and listen to the springs complaining, or stay where he was. He went over and picked up the phone, thinking it would be good to hear a voice. Preferably a female voice. He dialed his sister's number.
Keisha?
Aid, what you doing? Do you know what time it is?
You going to bed?
No, I'm waiting up for Dan. Keisha gave a theatrical sigh. Don't cabbies ever get day duty?
I doubt it. Not in London.
Or maybe only if they're white. Keisha mixed a laugh with a smoker's cough. Anyway, what's up?
Nothing. Just felt like a check-in. You said you'd keep an eye on Cindy for me.
It's okay, Aid. No one's raced her off just yet. I had her on the phone a couple of hours ago bothering me about what you was up to because you haven't phoned her. I'm going to have to charge you 2 fees if it carries on like this. Double time after midnight.
I can't call her for a while.
Well, that's a cute message. You want me to deliver that? I might need a crash helmet.
Look, Keisha, I have to rethink this thing with Cindy. I want her to be all right, but maybe I'm not cut out for the steady life.
Well, that you will most definitely have to tell her yourself.
Don't tell her anything, except I'm on assignment.
So, where are you exactly?
Can't tell you, Keisha, but I'm having a real fun time.
There was silence for a while as they both hung on to the connection.
Hey, Aid,
Yeah?
you're not getting into anything dangerous, are you?
I'm totally fine,
he said.
Liar. You know what, brother? When people start ringing up to check their family's okay, it means they're supposed to be watching their own back. Sure sign something's made them jumpy. Am I right or am I right?
You're always right, Keisha. But then, like you said, I'm a liar, ain't I?
Go to bed, Aidan, and make sure your door's locked.
You too, sis. Good night.
After the triangle fiasco, at least a dozen people found their way back to Lott's Road, and now they were lying zonked out all over the furniture. It was a pretty grotty scene, especially since the bloke who'd cut his foot insisted on bleeding all over the couch and wouldn't let anyone bandage it. Now he was lying on his stomach in a state of total oblivion, so Zig had managed to wrap an old T-shirt around it, bound with masking tape.
If we have to throw him out, she said, at least he should be able to walk on it.
Sharon didn't have any particular wish to throw people out, because she felt a lot safer in a crowd, even if they were mostly unconscious and likely to stay that way for the next 10 hours. She'd been looking for an opportunity to talk to Zig, but in a way she'd also been putting it off. Well, now was the time. She grabbed Zig by the arm. "I have to tell you something." Zig pulled away, her eyes hazy from the stuff she'd been taking.
Not now. I need to chill.
"Now," said Sharon decisively. "In here." She opened the door of the mattress room, half expecting to see the stranger again. Instead, she found Flack, sitting on one of the mattresses smoking, with the cat curled up beside him. "When did you turn up?" Sharon glared at him.
On the planet, 22 years ago.
"You know what I mean. How come you're here? You were supposed to be at the triangle." He looked up and stared at her, or rather through her, with wide, blank eyes.
Ah, was I? I must have thought better of it, mustn't I?
"Wait." Sharon grabbed Zig again as she was about to wander off and shut the door on the three of them. "I want to ask Flack something." He dragged on the cigarette, ignoring her. "I want to ask you what Sol was doing here this afternoon."
What?
Zig exploded. "Wait," Sharon said. "Just hold it, will you? I've been trying to talk to you all evening. Basically, I was in here looking in that mirror there, and I saw him behind me." Zig cut in.
How'd you know it was him?
"Because of the way the cat went for him to start with, and because he's not like anyone else I've seen. You wouldn't forget his face, would you?"
He looks like the angel Raphael.
Flack spoke in a falsetto voice.
Or is it the angel of death?
He wouldn't talk to me. Sharon was addressing Zig now. "Look, if I could have got him to stay, I would have. You know I would. I tried to tell him you were going demented looking for him, but he just went."
Went where?
"I saw him go down into the basement." Zig flung the door open and thundered down the stairs.
Get the light!
She yelled as she pulled at the trapdoor. Sharon grabbed the torch and followed, but they found the door of the workshop padlocked, just like before. Zig threw herself against it, crying and swearing, refusing all attempts to be coaxed back up into the house. There was nothing for it but to leave her there for the time being, so Sharon went back to confront Flack. "Seems to be a bit of a game of hide-and-seek around that workshop downstairs, and I think you should let us in on it, since we live here."
Who's us?
"Me and Zig."
You want to play hide and seek? I don't want to play anything. I'm asking you what's going on. With what in particular? With Sol. Ah, Sol.
Flack fell backwards onto the mattress and woke the cat, which hissed and stalked off to find another bed.
Which Sol are we talking about? You see, Sol is what you might call a collector. Collects personalities. So let's say he's managed to acquire something new in that line. It might be keeping him a bit busy.
Sounds to me like he's off his head.
Or his face. But again, see, which face? Some people only have one face and they don't even know how to use it, so it dies before they do, and they go around wearing a sort of a death mask. You notice that? I'd say a life mask is preferable, wouldn't you? Got to keep the flame burning.
Flack struck a match, held it up high above his head, and let it drop on the mattress. Sharon reached over to put it out, but he pushed her away and cupped his hand around the smoking patch.
That'll just burn through now, if it can't get the air. Fire has to have air. It has to breathe.
He struck another match, and another, tossing them up in the air, then blowing them out as they came down.
But not too much air, he said. So that's it, really, in the end. Those are the two alternatives in this sodding country. Suffocation or hot air. England's glory.
What?
Matches. England's glory, they're called, or used to be, with a little Union Jack on the box. Soon it'll be hard to get hold of these.
He rattled the matchbox.
They've discontinued them for some reason. All you'll be able to get is redheads with Bryant and May on the box. But I prefer to strike a light from England's glory somehow. It appeals to me. That's going to be the name of my next show. Would you like to be in it?
Sharon didn't reply.
Haven't you heard of the offer you can't refuse? I'm offering you a job, he said. I need an assistant.
Chapter 24. Gareth leant across the cafe table, gesturing with a creamy spoon. Trouble with you, Bryony, is you're all hung up about what's true and what isn't. Can't you see some things are appealing just because they bear no resemblance to reality? Bryony was studying a postcard of the beach at Aberystwyth, where they'd just been walking. The card was a 1930s drawing that showed tanned people in bathing suits cavorting about on the yellow sand or running into the frothy blue waves. Gareth had bought a dozen like this to send to all their friends. "You should be able to prosecute someone under the Trades Descriptions Act for this," she said. "Stay there. I want to do an experiment." She snatched up the Polaroid camera and ran out. A couple of minutes later she was back, waving the rapidly drying photograph. "There!" She put it on the table beside the postcard. "Just a minute. That's my camera, that is. Strictly for taking naked pictures of you. 50p a print's a bit steep for a snapshot of a grimy old beach, isn't it?" "So, you admit it's a grimy old beach?" The photo showed granite-blackened sand, grey sky, and a swirling sea that promised to be freezing cold even at the height of summer. "I'd never admit anything of the sort," said Gareth, smirking. "It's part of my childhood landscape, strictly for viewing through rose-coloured lenses. Now, if you don't want to write these, I will." He flipped over one of the cards and pretended to scribble as he spoke. "Dear Alan, having a lovely time. The sky is blue, the beach is golden, and I never expected a policewoman would be so good in bed." Bryony yelped and made a grab for the pen, but he caught her arm, turning it over, and began kissing the inside of her wrist in a way that started to cause a whole lot of muscles to weaken. "At least part of that's true," he said. "Come back to the hotel with me, Inspector Williams."
"It's a bed and breakfast. They don't expect you to be hanging around in the mornings while they're trying to clean the rooms."
"Wasn't hanging around that I had in mind exactly. Well, if we got to behave ourselves, I suppose we'd better have some more coffee, hadn't we?"
"I'll see to that. You get the papers."
She signed to the waitress and watched Gareth as he sprung over a chair that was in his path. He was a different person from the self-effacing bloke she'd met a couple of years ago in an Oxford bar. He moved quicker, stood straighter, smiled more. Was that really because of her? It was funny to think you could have that effect on someone. Perhaps he thought the same when he looked at her. The waitress, a bored teenager with a fresh, pretty face, scribbled the order while staring out of the window and didn't give Bryony so much as a glance. The teenagers around here seemed like a different generation from those in London. Apart from getting a bit pissed in the pub on a Friday night, the young people of ABBA didn't have much scope for wild experiment. London was like a great big playground for that age group, but it was also becoming a dangerous playground. Best not to think about that. Not while she was on holiday. She'd be back in the thick of it soon enough, and so would Gareth. What if some chic Parisian girl took a fancy to him, for the spring in his step, and the apologetic smile, and the quiet Welsh voice? Here he was again, but his mood seemed to have changed along with hers. The step was more of a trudge than a spring. "What's up?" she asked. "Nothing." He dumped a thick pile of newspapers onto the table. "Just that this lot reminds me of work. Only 4 more days, Bry."
"Funny. I was thinking the same. But 4 days is 4 days. You know what Macready says when we're on a murder case? Think of every day as a week. 4 weeks doesn't sound so bad, does it?"
"Does that mean I'm a bad case?"
"Shocking." She put a hand over his. "I wish we really did have another 4 weeks."
"Had we but world enough and time."
"What's that? Poetry?"
Andrew Marvell. A poem to persuade his mistress to go to bed with him.
"I thought you'd already done that."
2 coffees?"
chanted the waitress. They waited in silence as she set down the cups and saucers. Then Gareth leant forward, elbows on the table. "Come with me, Bry. Come and live in Paris. We could have such a great time together." Bryony shook her head.
"Wouldn't work. I don't even speak French. I'd be completely out of it. If you introduced me to the Paris in-crowd as my girlfriend, you might as well put a sack over my head. I'd be a complete nobody."
"And back here you're looking to be Detective Chief Inspector."
"I've worked hard for that. You know I have."
"But you could take 6 months out."
"If I cut loose now, I'll get sidelined. Chelsea's full of ambitious CID officers who'd be itching to take over my patch. Besides, Macready would take a dim view of it. He's the one who's given me all the breaks so far."
"You're not married to him, are you?"
"I'm not married to you either."
"You could be. Seriously, Bry. We could get married. Why not?"
"Look, Gareth, I'm not going to just drop everything and follow you round the world."
Her voice came out sharper than she meant, and he slumped back in his chair, pulling The Guardian onto his lap. Bryony fished out the Daily Mail and pretended to read, but she couldn't concentrate. Suddenly everything was out of kilter. She got up.
"I'm going for a walk on the beach."
"What? On your own?"
"You can come if you like."
"I'll catch you up later. I have to go through these." Outside, the wind was coming in wet squalls, so you couldn't tell whether it was rain or sea spray. Was this really July? She lowered her head and set off at a brisk pace, trying to let the wind blow her thoughts away. But the adrenaline only brought them out more strongly. Sometimes Gareth was impossible. He was lovely, but he was impossible. Couldn't he see that he was being unreasonable? After all, he wouldn't think of blowing his exciting new opportunity just to stay in England with her. And how could he bring up the suggestion of marriage in that way, as if it was just some kind of convenience for him? 2 firm hands grasped her shoulders from behind. "Don't run away from me, Bry. We'll sort it out." He turned her round, and she saw he looked confused, scared even. "We'll sort something out, won't we?" They walked on, arms tightly interlaced, listening to the gulls squawking, and the sea slapping at the beach, and the wind whipping at the sea. "You know, one of my worries is London's getting ugly," Gareth said. "I think I know more than most people about the ugly side of London. No, look, what I mean is, it's getting uglier. Much more random violence, bad vibes in the streets." "I can look after myself." By lunchtime, the wind had dropped, and some weak sunshine was breaking through the clouds. They bought fish and chips wrapped in yesterday's local paper, and sat on a bench to eat. "See," she broke off a piece of gleaming white fish. "Things are looking up." "That's my line. I thought I was the one being the optimist. I'm trying to learn how to have a sunny disposition. What about this, then?" Gareth smoothed out a sheet of the newspaper. "Topless sunbathers arrested in Traeth Dolwen Beach. What do you think about that, then?" "I think they must be a bit short of crime to report on." "They're short of sunny beaches as well, but just goes to show you never know your luck, do you?" "What did you do with all those papers you bought this morning?" "Left them in the cafe, didn't I?" "That's not like you, abandoning a pile of unread papers." "Well, now you know how much you mean to me, Bry."
"How about we get some more and take them back to our room?"
Is that a subtle way of telling me you're up for an afternoon of non-stop love-making? Why don't we just forget the newspapers?"
Their room was on the top floor, with a skylight that made the best of the afternoon sun. Gareth kicked the door to, and in one swift movement pulled off Bryony's T-shirt. He sat on the bed and took her hands. He kissed her wrists again, then her navel, working his way up. She dropped her head back and closed her eyes, hands clasped behind his neck. Later they went back to the beach to get the last of the afternoon sunshine. Bryony took off her shoes and ran to the edge of the water, yelping and laughing at the cold. She called for him to follow, taunting him for being chicken, then sprinted back and grabbed him by the arm.
"Come on!"
Gareth dug a toe into the caked sand.
"There's something I ought to tell you, Bry."
She waited for him to continue, but he didn't.
"Well, what?"
"That's not a good opening line, you know."
"Sorry, it's just... I don't want you overreacting to this."
She pulled away and stood facing him.
"Sounds worse and worse?"
"Yeah, all right. I've stuffed up, haven't I? There was something in the papers. At first I thought it might be better if you didn't know. Not yet, anyway. Not while we're on holiday."
Bryony's mind was working at lightning speed. "Something's happened in London. It's police news, isn't it?"
"Here, you better read it for yourself."
Gareth took a torn-out scrap of newspaper from his pocket and handed it to her. The wind kept trying to whip it out of her hands as she devoured the words.
"Attack on senior police officer. Commander Alexander Macready, one of the most distinguished senior officers in the Metropolitan CID, is in intensive care after having been viciously attacked by an intruder at his residence in Hampstead on Saturday night. He suffered knife wounds to the neck and shoulders, but managed to fend off his assailant and raise the alarm. His condition is reported as stable."
Bryony looked up at Gareth.
"Are there any other reports?"
"Times exclusive, apparently."
"I'll have to ring up and see how he is."
"Of course. Do you want some change?"
He delved into his pocket and produced £2 and some silver. But, Bry, don't get sucked in.
What's that supposed to mean?
Don't get sucked into the case. I know you.
Maybe I'm already in it. There was something going on before I left. I didn't tell you about it because, well, you know.
Confidential CID business.
Partly that. There's a phone box up by the pier. I won't be long.
After 10 minutes of frustration trying to get through to Macready's assistant, she gave up and rang Steve Latham's number. He answered the phone straight away.
The times got mixed up with your holiday reading, didn't it?
He said dryly.
What's happened, Steve?
We're still trying to find out. Macready's been in surgery, so he won't be out of the anaesthetic for another few hours. The Hampstead police found him semi-conscious, so he couldn't tell them anything last night. The DAC is charging in on his big white horse. Best thing you can do is stay where you are, Bryony. Out of trouble.
She disconnected, knowing that she'd already made a decision, and rang British Rail. Gareth was waiting for her on the promenade, leaning against the sea wall with his hands deep in his pockets, chin on his chest. He raised his eyes but not his head as he heard her coming. She stopped before she got within touching distance.
Gareth, I've just talked to Steve. Things are in a bad way.
Gareth wasn't going to make this easy for her. The expression in his eyes changed, but he didn't move or say anything. She swallowed.
Look, Gareth, I have to go back to London. There's a train at 5:10.
So that's it then, he said quietly.
What do you mean by that's it? I have to go back, that's all. It's an emergency.
It's always an emergency, isn't it? That's your job. 999 is your middle name.
I'm sorry. This is the last thing I wanted.
I don't think you know what you want. She looked up at him, startled at the tone in his voice, and met an unfamiliar, hard stare. Chapter 25. Logan put the phone down and smiled. Sometimes it was like this. You worked away, trying to break a story, but you could only get so far before you found yourself repeating all the approaches and getting no further into the heart of it. Then suddenly, out of the blue, it came to meet you. Some stories just wanted to be told. Best not get too excited before he'd checked out the bona fides. But an invitation to meet another member of the Suddens, face to face, was a breakthrough. The Mystery Men Act had started to bite in the British press now, with an article in the Daily Mail about the rockers in the rapist masks, and another in Time Out on the cult of secrecy surrounding the membership of the group. The Time Out journalist knew his stuff and included an identity parade, complete with photographs, of musos from the alternative scene who might be candidates. But that journo was driving by the wrong map, because it wasn't the music scene the Suddens were feeding off. It was something completely different. So you needed an inside line to even get started on the question of what they were really about. Logan checked back through his notes, then opened a clean page and did a stocktake. Who are the Suddens? 1. Flack? No secret. Frontman, lyricist, a.k.a. Gary Flaxman. 2. Kaiser. Guitar and vocals, paranoid wannabe SS man, a.k.a. John Polito. 3. Saul. Wacko with a wind-up problem. Writes some of the lyrics, makes the masks, but is he up there on stage? Sometimes. A.k.a. 4. Mr. X. Drums. Publisher of The Yeller, a.k.a. Johnny Mulligan. And then there were the extras, the ring-ins who got picked to experience the thrill of a single gig. Nice touch, that. They felt they were getting initiated into an exclusive club, but it was clever how they were kept from seeing anything that mattered, No introductions, just here's your guitar, kiddo, now get up there and play. They didn't need to know how to play. Soon as they got off stage, they were handed a £20 note. Double the session fee anyone else in the down-end club scene would get, and told to piss off. The extras didn't penetrate the secrecy. They added to it. On the other hand, if anyone who mattered, the cops, for instance, should find out what was really going down behind the scenes, there was a string of £20 witnesses at the ready who hadn't seen a thing. Flack was canny that way. But he had to depend on the solidarity of the band members, and there he'd made at least one big mistake. When it came to violence, the image and the actuality were two completely different things. And a couple of weeks ago, Kaiser saw something that freaked him out so much, he decided to grass to Logan Royce. So where was Johnny Mulligan in all this? Was he the real thing? Calling yourself Mr. X was a bit of a standing joke in the World's End pubs. But Kaiser had told him Mr. X was Johnny Mulligan, and no one else around the traps knew that. Most significantly, the guy on the phone knew all about the conversation Logan had had with Flack in the High Stepper. He had rung with an offer of the inside story on the Highgate show, a special vantage point, as he put it. From now on, every detail of this had to be documented. Logan had been making notes while he was on the phone, taking down the complicated instructions about how to find the meeting place, and trying to capture Johnny Mulligan's style of talk. It was different from the talk he'd been hearing over the past few weeks. Tighter, simpler, more formal somehow. We're looking to break into the American market, and that means a tour, which means passports and hotel registrations and all the rest of it. We always intended the mask thing to be temporary, but we've been able to spin it out much longer than we originally planned. The British press fall for everything we throw at them, so we thought we'd break the story through an American mag. If you want it, you might be in luck. It was even a bit disappointing to have it all laid out on a plate like that, with the raging anarchists turned into smooth-talking media stuntmen, more managed than the Sex Pistols and less dangerous than the Rolling Stones. Kaiser might just be suffering from amphetamine-driven paranoia, but on the other hand, this might just be a setup. Logan had a little Colt 9mm that he'd kept as a personal insurance policy, ever since he'd found himself too close to the front line at Altamont. Mostly the thing wasn't even loaded, but it was a really good way of saying back off if you got yourself in a bad situation. He took it out and checked it over, and on second thoughts decided to slip a bullet into the barrel. One would be enough. He was a good enough shot to know how to miss, and if these guys needed a more serious type of scare, he could give it to them. But that raised another issue. He drummed his fingers on the desktop, staring at the gun and frowning. If the Suddens really were dangerous, did that mean he had a responsibility now to give the police a tip-off about the where and the when for this concert? He picked up the phone and dialed directory inquiries, then followed up with a call to Chelsea Police Station, burbling something about a situation coming up that they might wish to monitor.
Yes, sir. Your name?
Logan hung up. Stupid idea, getting himself involved in a tip-off. There'd be no surer way to blow his chances of the scoop. He checked his watch again, then grabbed his keys, stashed the pistol inside his denim jacket and left. Outside, the weather had changed. The wind was up again. Rubbish bowled along the street. The people walking past were hanging on to their flapping clothes. Birds were flying every which way. A good day for the cemetery, Logan thought, as he looked up, assessing the clouds for rain. They were moving too fast to drop anything right now, he figured. But later, could be a good idea to have something waterproof at the ready. He stopped outside the tube station and bought a black plastic raincoat, smiling at the idea of ripping it up later and wearing it into sex. Maybe tomorrow he would do exactly that, show them he knew how to ring the changes on the Dylan look. Sharon had just returned from rehearsal, where Flack had shown her how to tie him up in chains and bandages and swing him up over the heads of the crowd. He seemed to know what he was doing, but it looked incredibly risky. Zig was obviously dead set on her going through with it, because it was a chance to find out what was going on behind the scenes.
"He won't expect you to know what to look for," she said. "He just thinks you're a pea-brained school kid."
"Gee, thanks."
"Well, I know you're smarter than that, don't I? Else I wouldn't be telling you to do it. Look, Sharon, I've done it myself. Played the assistant and got 20 quid cash in hand. And I couldn't have told anyone exactly what went down there under the stage because I hadn't a clue about it. That was before I got involved with Soul." She dragged on her cigarette. "Flack wouldn't let me anywhere near Soul now when he's on stage. He doesn't like girls getting too close to his precious band members."
"You said I had to know what to look for. So what am I looking for?"
"What's going on between them? Flack's had a bust-up with Kaiser, that's obvious. So watch how they act with each other. More than anything, I have to know if Soul's actually up there on stage with them. If it is Soul, they have ways of communicating, even with the masks on. Nods, looks, and these little sort of hand signals."
Zig demonstrated, holding up one finger, then two, and swivelling her hand around.
"Like they're agreeing this is going to happen or that's going to happen."
"What about their feet?" Sharon asked. "Can't you tell who they are from their feet?"
"Nah, they all wear those thick-soled factory boots. They got it all worked out, Sharon. I've been living with Soul for 8 months now, and I've seen all their concerts in that time, but you know I've never been able to find out who Mr. X is."
"What if he's a robot? Like one of those Doctor Who cyborgs?" Zig ignored the suggestion.
"What's really getting to me is I've got this idea it must be someone I know, but I've gone round and round in my head trying to figure it out. One thing I do know is Flack and Mr. X are like that."
She held up crossed fingers.
"There's some big agenda going between them."
"Like chaos and anarchy?" Sharon rolled her eyes. "That's obvious, isn't it?"
"You don't get chaos," said Zig, "without planning exactly what you're going to push off the rails."
When Logan emerged from the tube station at Highgate, the weather still looked very uncertain. Following the directions he'd been given, he made his way towards the cemetery, but decided to use the main entrance rather than Johnny Mulligan's recommended way into the western end, which involved climbing over walls and, very likely, cutting across backyards. At a pinch, the black raincoat might convince any over-vigilant gatekeepers that he had genuine business with the recently dead. Logan put it on, moved the gun to the pocket on the right side, and walked through the gates at a solemn pace, attracting a respectful nod from an elderly gardener who was tending the roses along the side of the path. Logan was not superstitious, but he didn't like cemeteries, especially the older kind, where the gravestones were toppling over and cracking apart, and the plants grew in vigorous tangles as if they'd been feeding on bone marrow. He'd read in the papers that they'd been having a lot of trouble with Satanists and vampire hunters in the wilder parts of the cemetery, and the caretakers had tightened up their act. Sounded like there were a few good stories in that too, but they were for somebody else. Ahead of him was a massive grey wall, carved with Egyptian-style pillars. Ivy and other kinds of trailing greenery spilt from the top of it and over the arched entranceway. He looked at the instructions he'd taken down in his notebook, trying to ignore the distant rumbling from somewhere over to the west. The arch led into a walkway, lined with low rectangular doorways, the Egyptian Avenue. He strode through and was momentarily startled by a grey figure lurking between two crooked trees with an arm raised, apparently in greeting. A stone woman with flowing stone hair and drapery. "Hi there, babe," said Logan. "Lighten up." As he took the next branch indicated on his map, he tried whistling to lighten his own mood, but the wind was getting up again, and he couldn't compete. According to the instructions, the path he was on was actually circular, and he needed to find an exit point between the tombs on his left. Sure enough, he spotted a yellow arrow painted on the wall, and made his way through the prickly undergrowth, stumbling on broken bits of gravestone that were too submerged in green tendrils to be visible underfoot. When he came out into the clearing, it was a relief to stand upright again, and, in spite of the rapidly darkening sky, to be able to see more than 2 feet in front of his face. He was now looking at a square mausoleum, rising about 6 feet above the ground. Okay, that's the stage. There was no sign of anyone else around, and the weather demons were cooking up a storm. The rumbling he'd heard before was replaced by a clean crack, loud enough to make him jump. He went across to the tomb to look at the carvings on the side, and noticed that the rising angels had chains attached to their ankles. Beneath them, almost hidden in the thistles growing from the base of the wall, was a horizontal figure with flames all around it. And above the whole picture, just under the roofline, there were some words. "A dead body revenges, not injuries." Very true, Logan thought. Except, of course, that dead bodies sometimes have friends and relatives who get the vendetta happening. Whoever wrote that never heard of the mafia. Around the other side of the tomb, he saw 2 oblong boxes, about the right size to accommodate a human corpse. But the lids were off, showing that one was filled with electrical cables and the other with chains. So, preparations were in train. Stupid to leave those cables exposed to the weather, though. It was getting darker by the minute, and occasional heavy drops were already splashing against the pale stone of the tomb wall. Since no one else was around to do the job, Logan picked up the lid and fitted it over the box. Then, for good measure, covered the other one as well. Now they looked exactly like 2 coffins, homeless dead in the storm. Because, he was realizing as he struggled to get his raincoat buttoned against the rising wind, this was looking to turn into something more than your average storm. Here he was, standing on the set of Taste the Blood of Dracula, and here was the thunder and lightning, right on cue. Didn't look like Mr. X was going to show. The weather must have scared him off. Logan cast around for some shelter and decided to make a dash for the trees, but was stopped by a blinding flash that cut the air seemingly inches from his scalp. He stood stunned for a few seconds as a massive tree branch, struck by the lightning, crashed to the ground. "Don't go there," he counselled himself. "Oh, man, don't go there." Logan turned and ran in the other direction, remembering that there was a door in the mausoleum. The handle was stiff and slippery with water, but using both hands, he managed to get it to turn. Then he used more force than necessary to push the door open and found himself tipping forward into the strange-smelling darkness. The door banged shut after him, and he had a moment's near panic, groping for the inside handle. He wedged the thing open with a heavy stone, then retreated further back into the space, away from the squalls of rain, and threw off his raincoat. Sitting on the floor, he pulled the notebook from his coat pocket. Since he was intending to write his article as an atmosphere piece, why not get the atmosphere down on paper while it was all happening? With cold, damp hands, it was almost impossible to write fast enough to capture the fully formed sentences that flashed into his mind. What was it that started to give him the feeling that he should be attending to something other than the wild scene he was facing through the doorway? Logan glanced behind him, just to get rid of the nagging impression. But that glance cost him the rest of a good line. Someone was standing there, against the back wall of the tomb. He scrambled to his feet, forgetting that he'd left the pistol in the raincoat at his feet.
"Jeez, you gave me a fright there. Why didn't you say something? Johnny, is it? Johnny Mulligan?"
But the man remained silent. Stay cool, Logan told himself. He might be just trying to psych you out. He peered into the semi-darkness, trying to make out the man's face.
"I'm Logan," he continued. "Quite a place for an interview, this. Wish I had a photographer with me."
As the man stepped forward, the light caught his features full on, but they were not the features of a living face. Logan managed to turn his cry of panic into a cough. It was a mask.
"Hey, I thought this was a face-to-face," he said,
raising an arm to grab the rubber and see what was behind it. But as he did so, something like a sharp punch in the ribs winded him and caused him to double over. He saw a metal thing poking out from his chest and vaguely registered surprise, puzzlement, then searing pain as a second thrust caught him in the back of the neck. Chapter 26. So, that's it then. Gareth's words echoed in her head as she waited on the station platform. What did he mean? Just that it was the end of the holiday. Surely that was all. But he hadn't even walked back to the guest house with her to collect her things. He just said he was going for a drink or several, and she let him go. It was all too much to cope with somehow. The news about Macready, and then Gareth's reaction to her going. She kept looking towards the platform entrance, thinking he'd appear any minute, to give her a great big hug and say, like he did this morning, "We'll sort something out, won't we?" But the train came, and he didn't. Looking out through the window at the never-ending green panorama of the Welsh hills, Bryony felt as if she was travelling out of a living world and into a bad dream. Life was work, and work was life. Life and death. How close had Macready been last night? By the time they reached Euston, it was nearly 9:30, and the light was fading. As soon as she got through the ticket barrier, she made for the nearest phone and rang Steve's office. She counted the ringtones. 3, 4, 5, 6. "Come on, Steve," she muttered. "I know you're there somewhere." "Yes," snapped a voice on the other end. It was immediately followed by a fit of coughing. "Steve, it's Bryony again. Sorry to interrupt a critical discussion with Pavan. Why don't you just get on with your holiday, Bryony? There's nothing you can do till you get back." "I am back. I'm at Euston. Meet me at the Draper's Arms, would you? They close late. I'll buy you a pint."
"Of whiskey? I'll be there in half an hour."
When she got to the pub, she found an empty table and stashed the hold-all underneath, so it wouldn't draw Steve's attention, or her own. It was starting to feel like a symbol of something bad she'd done. Killed a holiday. And there was its lumpy corpse, full of unwashed clothing. Steve arrived looking his most dishevelled, with stubble on his chin and purple rings under his eyes, his hair more frayed than usual. He slumped into the chair opposite her, as if his last drops of fuel were exhausted.
"I might have guessed you'd be sprinting back here," he said. "Where's Loverboy?"
Bryony wasn't prepared for this. She shook her head. If I'm buying the drinks, you answer my questions, not the other way round. What'll you have?"
"I told you. Whiskey. Double."
"You sure that's a good idea?"
"Do I look as if I can cope without the aid of toxic substances?"
As she waited to get served at the bar, Bryony processed a new concern. Steve. She ordered a single whisky, her own half of shandy, and a packet of Benson and Hedges, which she snuck in her pocket. Steve watched her as she came back with the drinks, transferring his gaze with mock intensity to the whisky glass as she put it on the table. "I asked for a double, Bryony. Quid pro quo. Didn't I come running out here at your beck and call? Aren't I about to cough up pearls of vital info in response to the endless string of questions you've got up your sleeve?" He picked up the glass and downed its contents, then watched as she took a sip of her own drink. "Go on, then," he said. "Fire away."
"Steve, I've had a quick think over there at the bar, and I've come to a conclusion. On balance, it's better for you to ruin your lungs than your brain. So please, do everyone a favour and keep to your usual poison." She took out the cigarettes and put them on the table.
"Well, you might be right, but the family doctor wouldn't agree. A couple of months ago he referred my father for a cough that's turned out to mean lung cancer, and he's given me dire warnings that I'm heading for the same condition if I go on chugging."
"I'm sorry, I didn't realise."
He stood up. "Matches, just a minute." He came back with the matches, giving the box a cheery rattle as he put it on the table. Then he unwrapped the cigarettes with a loving hand, put one in his mouth, lit it, and exhaled with a theatrical sigh of satisfaction. "Now, Macready, I saw him at the hospital a couple of hours ago, and he's not in too bad shape, considering he lost a couple of pints of blood. He's got a deep stab wound in the chest and a slash across the side of the neck that's taken some intricate stitching. But he should mend all right if he's prepared to follow doctor's orders."
"Was he able to tell you about the attack?"
He drew on the cigarette and inhaled sharply, holding the smoke for a couple of seconds. "God, that's good." The smoke came out with the words. "The attack, yes." He inhaled again. "Macready's desk faces the window, so he can look out at the garden, and he sits with his back to the door. Just a minute." He strode across to the bar, came back with 2 whiskies, and placed one of them in front of Bryony. "I don't drink this stuff," she said firmly. He gave a lopsided smile and tipped the contents of her glass into his. "No, you do. Would you like something else? Bottle of pop? Raspberry cordial?"
"I'm fine. You were telling me about what happened to Macready."
"Ah, yep." He frowned, as if gathering his thoughts, and the next bit came out at a run. "Assailant entered the room without his noticing, proving conclusively that, contrary to his firm belief, Sir doesn't actually have eyes in the back of his head or ears that serve as long-range antennae. So that's shaken him up as much as anything, but fortunately his reflexes are up to scratch." There was a pause, and his face went blank, almost as if he'd lost the thread. Macready fell between the chair and the desk, pulling the phone down with him. He indicated with a pointing hand, as if envisaging the scenario on the luridly patterned carpet beside him. "Grabbed the chair and used it to parry the next thrust." He dragged on his cigarette. "Managed to trip the guy up and took the chance to dial 999, excuse me." He got up and strode over to the bar again, returning a couple of minutes later with another whisky, a single. "See?" He held up the glass. "How's that for restraint? Now, where was I?"
"The report in the paper said the assailant was masked," said Bryony. "What sort of mask?"
He coughed a couple of times. "Trying to get some clarity on that. Not one of those leather things." The last couple of words were slurred. He picked up the glass and held it close to his face, sipping between phrases. Bryony was sitting forward in her seat.
"Then what kind of mask?"
A spasm of coughing interrupted the question, and, as Steve tried to quell it with what was left in his glass, Bryony dived back to the bar for some water. She placed a jug and 2 glasses on the table in front of them.
"OK, Steve, this is what we're drinking from now on. And I have to get to the bottom of something that may or may not be to do with this case."
He stared at her, red-eyed and dogged, with barely enough energy left in the lines of his face to convey the usual irony. She pressed on. "I've seen the way you look when a case is keeping you working round the clock, and it's not pretty. But I've never seen you in a state like this before. You need help, Steve. Professional help. Even I'm enough of a psychologist to see that."
"So am I, as a matter of fact. Easier said than done. Help, that is."
There was silence as he lit a new cigarette and twisted the match out, gazing at it like he'd forgotten she was even there. "What's happened about your flat?" she asked. "You said the Sockos were doing a lot of work in there. Did you move out?"
"I was given a room in a Holland Park hotel at the expense of the Met. Diabolical place. You could hear everything through the walls. Cleaning woman arguing with the owner about her hours. Couple next door having a barney about what they were doing or not doing in bed. I can give you the details about that if you like. I remember them vividly. Couldn't stand it, so I checked out this morning."
"So where will you go tonight?"
"Home,"
he said. As they came out of the pub, Bryony hailed a taxi. She threw the hold-all inside and grabbed Steve by the arm. "Come on, I'll drop you off."
"What do you mean, drop me off? Since when was Islington on the way from here to Camden High Street?"
"Get in, Steve." "Islington, Wallace Road," she instructed the driver. Bryony sank back into the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, getting flashbacks of Gareth on the Aberystwyth seafront.
"You know,"
Steve's voice intruded on her train of thought.
"You know, I don't think that boyfriend of yours would be too happy if he could see you now, sitting in a taxi at 11 o'clock at night with another man. What do you think about that?"
"Let's just leave Gareth out of this, shall we?" she snapped. "That's my private life. It's none of your business."
"Sorry, but it wasn't such a brilliant idea of yours, rampaging back to London like this when we've got a nutter on the loose, with you on his hit list. I don't know if you ought to go back to that little flat of yours. In fact, I probably shouldn't allow it."
The words were slow and slurred, as if he was already half asleep, but he kept on.
"Seeing I'm the only bugger who actually knows you are back here, planning to tuck yourself up in bed all on your own. What if he's lying in wait for you?"
"There's a patrol on my flat, remember? When I get home, I'll phone them and let them know I'm there."
"Nuh-uh."
The shake of the head was slow and emphatic.
"Not a satisfactory arrangement."
"If you're going back to your flat, why can't I go back to mine? We're equally at risk." That wasn't actually true. Steve was drunk, so he was the one in most danger. "What are we going to do, then? Are both of us going to try and book into one of those little hotels at this time of night?"
"You said it."
There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle.
"What, they've only got one room? A double room? Imagine explaining that to the Welshman."
"Just shut up a minute, will you? Let me think." Her mind was going round in circles.
"Tell you what,"
said Steve. He leant forward and tapped on the glass panel behind the driver's head, then raised his voice.
"Excuse me, driver. Changed our minds. We want to go to Camden High Street."
"That's the other direction," said the cabbie. "Means we'll have to go back all the way round King's Cross Station."
"Sorry,"
Steve said flatly.
"Don't matter to me. It's you that's paying."
Steve slid the panel shut again and turned to Bryony.
"We're both going to your flat. It's the obvious solution. I'll sleep on the sofa, and you can lend me your old hockey stick for the fence."
Accustomed as she was to getting home at all hours of the night during an intensive investigation, Bryony had to admit to herself that she was glad to have the shuffling presence of Steve behind her. The shoe shop underneath her flat was a very small business and didn't have window lights at night, so the street entrance was in a dark spot. Almost as soon as she opened the door, the phone started ringing. Dropping the hold-all, she pelted up the steps and caught it.
Where the hell have you been, Bryony? I've been ringing for the past 2 hours. Gareth, sorry. She was trying to get her breath back, her thoughts in a whirl, when Steve, lumbering through the door with the hold-all, called out, "Where do you want this?" "Who's that?" demanded Gareth. "Shit. It's Steve. He's just seeing me home. We had a late briefing." There was silence on the other end. "Are you there?" she said gently. "Seeing you home, is he?" "It's because there's been some—" The phone disconnected. "Oh, shit!" Bryony exploded. Steve dropped the bag. "What's up? Who's that?" She sank into the sofa, hands over her face. "Oh dear," said Steve. "Gareth, wasn't it? What a stuff-up." Still covering her face, Bryony made an effort to keep her voice low and steady. "You have to go, Steve. Now, go to a hotel on your own. Get another cab, please. Please, just go." After he'd left, she realised she was actually shaking all over. There was tension in every nerve of her body, and her mouth was dry as she picked up the phone again and dialed the number for the guest house in Aberystwyth. Praying silently, she counted the rings. 8, 9, 10, 14, 15, 16, 17. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was stern and abrupt. "Is that Mr. Hughes? I'm sorry," Bryony said. "I'm really sorry to disturb you, but I wonder if Gareth Daniels is there, in room 5. It's sort of an emergency." "It's a better be this time of night. Got me out of bed, you did. Mr. Daniels left earlier this evening, so I can't help you, I'm afraid." Bryony stood clutching the receiver. She could call his number in Paris, but he couldn't possibly have got back to Paris. If he'd taken the last train out of Aber, he might have been able to get as far as London. Yes, he might be in London. But where? She tramped wearily into the bathroom and, feeling completely wretched, began to run a bath. So that's it then. Her head was throbbing. She opened the bathroom cabinet to look for some Disprin and came face to face with the little box of Minilin that she'd left behind. She grabbed it and threw it in the waste bin in the corner. Some hours later she was curled up on the bed, sunk into that strange comfort zone sleep can offer when life seems to be falling apart on you. From somewhere distant, a phone began to ring. "Gareth," she muttered, hauling herself back to consciousness and practically throwing herself out of bed. Enough light came through the uncurtained sitting-room window to help her navigate a straight course to the telephone table. She grabbed the receiver and clutched it to her ear, muttering a silent "please." But there was silence on the other end, too. "Gareth?" The tears came again, fuzzing up her words. "Gareth, if it's you, please speak to me. You've got the wrong idea. There's no one else here, I promise you. I don't want it to be all over, really, I don't, Gareth." Silence. She waited, holding her breath. No, that wasn't Gareth. That wasn't Gareth's silence she could hear. The disconnecting click sounded, and she was left standing in the dark, listening to the live burr of the telephone. Chapter 27. After the stormy interlude of yesterday, the heat was back in full force. Aidan picked up the bulky leather jacket he'd obediently sweated in for the past 10 days and let it drop back on the bed. Something had to be done about that thing. He eased the penknife out of the lining and used it to cut around the armholes. Not an easy job. It took him several minutes on each side to slice through the thick leather, hacking roughly across the seams under the arms. But when he'd finished, he realised he'd done himself a big favour.
He slipped the dismembered garment over his bare chest and swung his arms in circles from the shoulder, feeling the rush of air. When the phone rang, he tossed the receiver from one hand to the other before putting it to his ear. It was Doc Latham, ringing over an hour past the agreed contact time. The surprise was that he'd rung at all.
I was told I had to talk to you every day, Doc. What happened to yesterday or the day before? When I phone you, I get no Daddy the other end.
Sorry. It was a sulky concession. Things have been happening, Aidan. I better fill you in. Can you meet me in half an hour?
Depends where. I got an important date today, up in the Highgate Cemetery.
That's all right. I'm in Islington. There's a wimpy bar on the Holloway Road, just a bit up from the tube station. I'll be there at 11. Aidan walked into the rendezvous at 10 past, to find the Doc hunched over a glass of Coke and looking distinctly the worse for wear. He turned awkwardly towards Aidan, as if he had a stiff neck.
Hey, you've ruined that lovely jacket.
'Bout time, too,
said Aidan, throwing his keys on the table and straddling the chair opposite.
I'm learning how to dress for work. You ordered anything to eat?
Do me a favour. Don't bring any of those wimpy burger things near me. I'm feeling fragile.
Cure for your condition, Doc, is a glass of orange juice, 2 aspirin, and a good lie down with a packet of frozen peas on your head.
Thanks. I'll remember that. Now, let's get on with it, shall we? Your report, Aidan. Far away.
You're supposed to call me Nick, remember?
Steve got out his notebook.
Who effing cares? Nobody round here is going to know either of us from Wild Bill Hickok. Just get on with it, will you? Last time I talked to you, you'd met up with that journalist who seemed to have a promising inside line.
Logan Royce.
Aidan went through the details of their second conversation and the encounter with Flack at the Hot Stepper.
This was Saturday, right?
Steve looked confused.
What time did you say?
We got there about 10.
You sure about that? When you say about 10, do you mean before or after?
Just before. I checked the time soon as we arrived.
Steve clasped his head in both hands.
Oh, stuff you, Aidan. Do you realise you've just given our prime suspect an alibi?
For what?
McCready got attacked on Saturday night at his home in Hampstead, somewhere between 9:30 and 10.
Are you okay?
Basically, no. It was some kind of knife attack. He was quite badly injured, but he seems to be on the mend.
Why is Flack your prime suspect?
The question prompted a mini-lecture on the case history, to which Aidan listened with mounting annoyance. He'd known about the death row gag, obviously, but to this point no one had even mentioned the arson attacks on McCready and Latham. Come to think of it, maybe D.I. Williams had tried to say something, but he'd been fobbed off with some vague stuff about keeping a lookout for anyone with pyromaniac tendencies. Since he'd also been told to keep a lookout for Flack, that just about meant the same thing. If he'd known why, he'd have played his hand differently over the past few days.
You look a bit pissed off, Steve finished up. Want to talk about it?
I'm just wondering if you told me what I need to know yet. I don't like to go off half-cocked, Doc, especially when I'm dealing with people that might have homicidal tendencies.
Sorry, Steve muttered, avoiding his eye. I wasn't authorised to brief you on this before. Now let's get through the rest of your report, shall we? What's this mission you've got up in Highgate Cemetery? Well, two could play at the game of selective reporting, Aidan thought. What if he didn't mention the fire show till afterwards? That would be one way of preventing the scenario he was most worried about, a uniformed invasion of the Highgate Assembly. Most likely they'd just send a car round, but then its occupants would get pelted with bottles, so they'd call for backup, and there'd be an ugly scene. He'd witnessed enough of that sort of confrontation in Notting Hill, when some of the carnival parties carried it a bit too far and got the truncheons on their backs. Trouble is, he thought, most of the police don't know how to handle a crowd situation. They panic, especially if the crowd has a bit of an exotic look to it, and the wild beast comes out on both sides. If that happened, nobody was going to find out anything. He decided evasive tactics were justified, so he threw the ball back in Steve Latham's court. "The Suddens are doing a show this afternoon. Anything you specially want me to look out for?" Steve's eyes narrowed. "You sure you should be going to a place like Highgate Cemetery without backup? It's a complete jungle in there, and it attracts all the wackos in the business. You must have heard the stories. The vampire hunters have gone quiet since they locked up the ringleaders, but you never know when there might be a renewed outbreak." He shook his head. "Psychotic stuff. You know, one lot exhumed a corpse, cut off its head, drove a stake through what was left of its chest cavity, and left it sitting against a tree trunk. Not planning on witnessing anything like that, are you?"
"I seriously doubt it. That's not the Sudden style. They're doing a concert, so I'm asking what you want to know."
"Just take photos," said Steve. "Lots of them." Zig was all geared up for the concert, her hair spattered with green, and a black and white zigzag painted up the centre of her face like a streak of lightning. She was wearing leather trousers and the rubber vest with the yellow splash across the front. So, contrary to Sharon's theory, she must have just been waiting for the right opportunity to show it off. Sharon was no competition. She had to wear a boiler suit and plimsolls because of her part in the show. But in her own way she was geared up. In her mind she'd been over and over the routine she'd been taught. Her nerves were on edge. It was Zig's idea to get there early and find the underground route through the back part of the cemetery. She led the way along a path through the crazy jungle of creepers and through a gate into a crescent-shaped street lined with stone tombs.
"Circle of Lebanon," she said. "There's supposed to be an opening in here somewhere."
Sharon wasn't all that enthusiastic about the prospect of going through another tunnel, especially one in which a lot of dead people were stacked. She lagged behind, staring at the tombs that lined the curved path, each with its identical door surmounted by a neat little triangular roof. She didn't believe in ghosts, but all the same, she was getting a funny feeling that some weird, crumpled face might poke out from one of the doorways and beckon.
"Sharon!"
a voice hissed from behind her. She wheeled around. Zig.
"What are you doing sneaking up on me like that?" "It's a circle. You were going so slow I caught up with you. I found the way in."
Sharon got out her torch and followed Zig through the entrance to one of the tombs. Just inside the door there were steps leading into the darkness below, where an immense quietness enveloped them. The sound of their feet on the soft ground seemed to come from a long way away, yet the earth pressed in close on both sides. As they walked together in silence, Sharon started to relax. The coolness and silence made her feel calm, calmer than she'd ever felt before. Funny that, when there were dead people lying in the earth either side of you, and probably even just above your head. Now she was so close to them, she didn't feel scared anymore, not a bit. The tunnel curved round, then went upwards, with little steps cut into the ground every couple of feet. Here there was writing on the wall, but it looked quite different from the graffiti Sharon had seen in the World's End tunnel. The words were carved into the smooth sides of the earth in neat, even letters, like the words on a gravestone. From the dens of night crying, Empire is no more. After that message, someone had painted a swastika. A few yards further on, they came to an elaborately moulded archway, with pillars either side, and a triangular stone shape above it, like the ones over the tomb entrances outside. Inside the triangle was written, "And now the lion and wolf shall cease." In the corners there were faces with staring eyes and lion mouths carved into the stone. Zig stopped, keeping the light of her torch directed upwards.
"So," she said, "this is his work."
"How do you know?" Sharon whispered. "I thought all this was really old." But now she looked more closely, she could see that the lines were fresh and clean, quite unlike those of the tombstone carvings they'd seen on the way through the cemetery. Zig reached up and traced the outline of one of the faces with her finger, then began to scratch at it until she pulled something away. She held it out in the palm of her hand, a piece of red string.
"This is what he uses for edging, remember? We found some before on the railing."
Beyond the archway was a flight of steps that brought them to a square chamber lined with shelves. And on the shelves were coffins, all falling to bits, so you could see bony hands and feet through the rotten wood.
"Holy shit!"
muttered Zig, moving in with her torch beam on the head and shoulders of a desiccated corpse that had spilled out of its box. At the farther end of the chamber was another flight of steps, surrounded by a lot of jumble that didn't look as if it belonged to the residents. Amongst it was a fire extinguisher, a canister of kerosene, and a glass jar labelled Van Helsing Stage Blood Capsules, with a picture of a drooling vampire. She recognised this as Flack's gear. But whose was the plastic Mac someone had thrown down the stairs? It had landed there like a dead bat, and when she kicked it aside, she saw there was something underneath, a little notebook with a spiral binding. She picked it up and was about to take a look when they heard the sound of footsteps above them and had to snap off their torches. Aidan turned into Bacon's Lane behind the cemetery to see tribals spilling out from the back of a battered panel van that had just pulled up. There was quite a little collection of vehicles here, most of them probably borrowed or stolen for the occasion. Leaving the Vesper against a tree, he did a bit of scouting round, camera in hand, to get some points of orientation. To the left there was a rise in the ground, and he could see a rounded grey roof above the greenery. He took some pictures, then turned back and found himself eyeball to eyeball with a wild stranger. A fox with a devilish stare and erect russet brush frozen in his way. Beware of the resident demons, Aidan thought, and gave the creature a wide berth. He could hear snatches of human talk carried on the breeze, so he headed in that direction and had no difficulty finding the tribe. Their vertical hair, freshly treated with supplies of crazy colour that somebody had bought in bulk at the markets and sold at the pub last night for grossly inflated prices, was visible before he got within close range. He positioned himself so he could hear, but kept out of sight, though it was hardly a thrilling bit of eavesdropping.
"Yeah. Nah. Well, he doesn't reckon it's... Nah. Could have done with a bit of... Well, he's a tosser, isn't he? He's a sodding tosser."
The last comment came across loud and clear.
"Takes one to know one, boy,"
Aidan muttered. Trouble with this lot was they were a bunch of camp followers, waiting for someone to lead them into more interesting forms of destruction than they could find of their own accord. And the leaders? The question of whether the Suddens were going to turn up this time was answered a few seconds later by a violent outburst of screeching like a flock of crows gone psycho from somewhere in the trees ahead. A current of energy seemed to charge through the tribe, still scattered through the wilderness of brush and ivy. They doubled their pace, converging in the direction of the noise. Chapter 28. "He's still in intensive care," said the clerk. "I'll have to transfer you." Bryony looked at her watch. She'd already been transferred twice, from reception to patient inquiries, then to the registrar's office. There were clicks on the line, and a brisk voice answered. "Royal Brompton Intensive Care Unit." For the third time, she asked about Macready. "Who am I speaking to?" asked the nurse. "I'm Bryony Williams, a colleague of his. I'd like to visit him this morning, if possible. Commander Macready's still recovering from surgery, so he only has one visiting hour today, 3 to 4 p.m. I'd like to see him privately. It's in connection with an inquiry that is rather sensitive." The voice switched from brisk to stern. "He's recovering from surgery, Miss Williams. He can't be disturbed by anything like that. Perhaps you'd like to make an appointment with him when he returns to work in a few weeks." Damn, she'd done this all wrong. "Would you be kind enough," she said in her own sternest professional voice, "to tell him Detective Inspector Williams called to wish him a speedy recovery." She hung up and stared at the phone, torn between leaving it alone in case Gareth should ring again and calling Steve at his office, just to be sure he was okay and back in circulation. No, she would not phone Steve. He'd got her into enough trouble already. Anyway, he'd probably phone her soon enough. As if in response to her thought, the ringtone started up and sent a jolt through her whole nervous system. Inspector Williams. Macready's voice, a little croaky but unmistakable. "Sir, I came back as soon as I heard." "You should not have done so. It was consoling to picture you running along a beach somewhere, out of harm's way." She expected this and ignored it. "How are you, sir?" "Still in one piece, I'm pleased to report. And I have remarkably good accommodation here. Things have changed, Williams, since I was treated for tonsillitis in an Aberdeen children's ward. I have a private room with a telephone, and they have yet to threaten me with carbolic. I'm to be interviewed by the Amstead CID at 3, but I think we should talk. Come at 2. Bryony stood up, realising that her back and shoulders were almost locked with tension. There was a sharp rat-a-tat on the front door, a police knock, but best to be cautious all the same. She looked out of the window and saw Pavan's car parked below. He was standing on the doorstep, looking superb in a deep blue shirt, accompanied by Ken Keegan. "Bryony." Pavan shook her hand warmly. "I hear you had a silent caller last night, 2:19 a.m. "That's right." She led the way up the stairs. "But why is that part of your brief?" "It isn't, but I was told about it, which is how I knew you were back. Following the attack on Macready, I've been asked to supervise a daily forensic check here, and you must be aware that you will have to find somewhere else to stay, temporarily. Could we sit down for a moment?" "Sure." She perched on the edge of the sofa. Pavan turned to his assistant. "Give us a few minutes, would you, Ken? If you wouldn't mind waiting outside." He sat at the table by the window with his legs crossed. "You shouldn't have come back, Bryony. It was a mistake." She took her time responding. "A mistake?" she repeated. "From whose point of view?" "Have you absolutely no sense of self-preservation?" "It's my job to negotiate dangers, not run away from them, Pavan. If I must, I'll pack up and find a hotel room, but I intend to be part of this inquiry. I saw Steve Latham last night and got a rough account of what happened to Macready, but we didn't get to any of the detail. Since this was a second intrusion, there must have been added security on the house. I assume there was no repetition of the bathroom window trick." "No, there wasn't. The bathroom window, like all the others in the house, has been fitted with bars narrower than standard specifications. Both external doors, front and back, have new double-cylinder deadlocks. We haven't found any signs of tampering." "So what's your explanation?" Pavan's mouth tightened as he thought. "As you know, Bryony, a skilled burglar can get the better of almost any lock. It's a matter of having some knowledge of how the mechanism works, what the component parts are, and so on. All the same, there would be forensic traces of even the most expert lockpicker's work." Keys, she said quietly. Who has them? Apart from Macready, myself, and the lab liaison officer. Ken. Bryony went to the door and asked Ken to come in. He didn't seem remotely disconcerted to be asked about the keys, and he showed her where he carried them, attached to his belt with a steel chain. "They never leave my desk unless they're here," he said, giving the chain a rattle. The three of them sat for half an hour talking through details and possibilities, going over the same points repeatedly, until Bryony said, "Look, let's leave the technicalities for now. What strikes me is that this is in every respect a different M.O. from that of the original intrusion. First, if he's that good at picking locks, why didn't he do it the first time? Why go through all that athletic performance with the bathroom window? Then, this was a different type of attack. The first intruder comes in broad daylight and does something that advertises his visit immediately. The second gets in at night, and if he sprung Macready without being heard, with the silence of a panther, Macready could hear a watch tick in a crowded room. I don't think we're dealing with one person here. This is some kind of group enterprise." Pavan's expression hadn't changed. "On the other hand," he said, "all the evidence points to there being only one assailant on Saturday night. Macready saw a single person, and the fact that he managed to thwart the attack is itself evidence of there being no accessory present." "No accessory present inside the house," Bryony interjected. "Could have been someone outside, with a car perhaps. Are there tyre tracks?" "Afraid not. The garden path leads directly from the main road, so any vehicle would have been pulled up on a surface passed over by countless other sets of wheels. If there was a vehicle, the best we can hope for is a sighting." "All right." Bryony leant forward, concentrating intensely. "Another thing. This was unfinished business. If the intruder had completed his mission, Macready would have been a goner." It was Ken's turn to interrupt. The three of them fell silent again, and again it was Bryony who spoke first. "He wore a mask, this guy, is that right?" "That's what Steve told me, but he didn't say what kind of mask." "We don't know yet," said Pavan. "We're waiting to talk to Macready about it." "I'll ask him myself. He's given me the okay to visit him this afternoon. But in general, you can say that masks are theatrical, aren't they? Sudden death wear them as part of a stage act. So from the viewpoint of the perpetrator at least, this could have been some kind of performance. How was it supposed to end?" No one wanted to answer that. "Well, I suppose we can't get any further with this right now." Bryony stood up. "I'd better go and pack my case again." "Where will you go?" Pavan asked. "If this goes on much longer, I suppose they'll get me fixed up with a police flat or something. In the meantime, I'd better find a cheap hotel." Ken suddenly became animated. "There's a good one in Cadogan Square called the Fifield. My niece stayed there last year. Ask for the room on the top floor. They don't have a lift, so any unwanted visitor would have to toil up 4 flights of stairs." Bryony wandered into the bedroom and picked up her still-to-be-unpacked hold-all. She unzipped it and took out the swimsuit and sarong, which looked squashed and lifeless. Blocking out the associations they had, she collected some work clothes from the wardrobe and crammed them into the bag. There was time to check out the hotel before her appointment at the hospital, and it was fine, friendly and efficient, with plenty of staff around. The little room was like a maid's bedroom from the Victorian era. Warped wooden floor, narrow bed with an iron frame, and window set right up under the roofline. She looked out and discovered there was a bird's-eye view, quite literally, above the tree line and clear over both ends of the street. She checked her watch, then splashed her face in the basin, changed into a clean blouse, and skittered down the 4 flights of stairs. When she was shown into Macready's room, Bryony's first thought was that she'd walked through the wrong door. The man in the bed was wearing a cheap green pyjama shirt, opened to accommodate a neck brace and chest bandage, and he appeared older and thinner than Macready. Clearly the attack had taken its toll on him. One look at his face was enough to tell her the story of blood loss, pain and shock that he'd been through. Besides which, she realised, she'd never seen him before without his whole regalia of collars and waistcoats, cuffs, buttons and turn-ups. Now she was seeing what lived beneath the suit of armour, and it seemed all wrong that it should be exposed to view. The voice, mercifully, was unchanged. "Sit down, Williams. There's a chair there somewhere, I believe. Perhaps you could move it a little further down that way." He pointed towards the foot of the bed. "So I can see you." She followed instructions, taking in the disturbing array of drips, drug trays and hanging charts with which he was surrounded. "I've been told no more than 15 minutes, sir. And the nursing staff here look every bit as snarly as any watchdogs from the Met." She drew breath. "You mentioned that you're being interviewed by a CID team this afternoon, but Steve Latham and I had a talk last night and you identified the points on which you urgently wished to interrogate me. Let me go through them." He paused, swallowing awkwardly and with obvious pain. Bryony judged it best to avoid trying to prompt or otherwise help him along. "Skipping the details of time and circumstance which will no doubt already have been gathered by the Hampstead police." Another swallow. "First, the assailant. 5'11", slightly built, dressed in black. Hands, gloved. Feet, black workman's boots with laces, probably elastic-sided. Be so good as to pass me that glass of water." His hand was shaking, and there was some awkwardness as he accepted that he had to let her help him drink by holding the glass steady while he sipped as best he could, unable to prevent runnels of water from escaping down his chin. When he'd finished, he made as if to push her away, then suddenly grabbed her hand. "You're still a young woman, Williams. You should leave this turmoil behind you. Take your share of lightness and ease." He let her go and sank back against the pillows, still holding her with his eyes. "Why do you choose to spend your life in this way, facing death at every turn?" "I don't know, sir." Bryony's mind had gone blank. This was not a side of Macready she'd ever encountered. She'd seen him angry, frustrated, exhausted, but never like this. "I really don't know. Somehow it's what I felt I had to do, even before I knew anything about police work. And I've always thought—" She hesitated, knowing that she was venturing onto a new level of frankness. "I've always thought you were like that too." She smiled. "I can't imagine you doing anything else, sir." There was silence for a moment, and Macready closed his eyes. But just as Bryony was thinking she should leave, he spoke again. "You're right, Williams. It's our calling. We're the ones called to know the darkness and find ways to fence it in. But when it suddenly breaks through our own defences and invades us, what then? I hope you never see the face I saw." This was odd. What about the mask? Had he actually seen his assailant, or was he hallucinating? Macready was the last person to succumb to hallucination, but looking at him lying there, with his eyes closed, she wondered. "We need the description, sir," she said gently. "Anything you can remember." His voice switched back to professional mode. "It was a mask, made of some kind of rubber or latex, a sophisticated piece of work, replicating the features of Maxwell Trimley with a high degree of accuracy." No, this was not hallucination. But Bryony was puzzled. "I thought you said you saw his face." "The face I saw was Trimley's, with someone else's eyes behind it. If I believed in demons, I would say that I had met one." Chapter 29. On the way back through the tunnel, they heard voices and had to turn off into the old catacombs under the hill.
"This is where the vampires are supposed to sleep,"
said Zig. All the same, she didn't seem in too much of a hurry to get out. Sharon guessed she was hoping to come across some more traces of Sol. Maybe he was actually living down here. But if he was, Sharon didn't care right now. She was getting spooked and starting to wonder if they'd ever find the way back up to the daylight. Then out of nowhere, noise was exploding through the earth, a sort of screeching that seemed to come from every direction, echoing through the tunnels. They broke into a run, and when they got round the next corner, they realized the sound was coming from a particular direction, further along and to the left. A couple of minutes later, they saw daylight streaming down a set of narrow, broken steps that led almost vertically upwards. They fought their way out through a mess of creepers to find that the noise had moved further off again.
"It's just the acoustics," said Zig. "Let's try that way."
As they waded through waist-high flowering creepers, the noise kept stopping and starting. Every time it kicked in again, Sharon felt a jolt pass right through her, and the moments of silence were filled with tension, because the intervals were so irregular. You never knew when the next burst was coming. Eventually, they came in view of a massive stone tomb with a lone black figure standing on the roof. Kaiser. He was playing off the feedback from the mic, blending the vocals into its explosive surges, the shape of his mouth altering behind the zipper teeth in the mask as he changed pitch. Feeling she didn't need to stick with Zig any longer now, Sharon skirted the outer edges of the crowd, looking for an opening through which she could thread her way to the front, and caught sight of Flack, sitting astride a big branch that stretched over towards the roof of the tomb. Well, if he could be up there, so could she. The boiler suit and sneakers she'd been given to wear were definite assets in this situation. She hauled herself up on a big wooden crate that was placed beside the tomb, threw her arms around the branch, and jumped. She ended up swinging in mid-air, and Flack took his time coming to the rescue. But once she was up there, it was worth the effort. Bird's-eye view. She could see a square opening in the roof of the tomb, from which billows of orange smoke were escaping. Another masked man rose amid the clouds. Mr. X. The white letters stood out against the black leather on his forehead, and he used 2 wooden sticks to set up a heavy clattering beat on the drum slung round his neck. It was like a marching rhythm, except that it got slower and slower. A funeral march, maybe, carrying on steadily under Kaiser's shrieks. Smoke kept pouring out, turning from orange to yellow, then green, then a vivid blue that thickened to purple as they started playing the opening of the sudden death anthem.
"Garbage is falling out of the sky. Better get out of here, don't ask why. There's no tomorrow for Sodom and Gomorrah. If you turn around, you're only gonna die."
The audience joined in the chorus.
"Oh, you don't get nothing 'cause there's nothing left, but we know what you're asking for. Sudden death! Sudden death!"
The 2 final words became a chant, repeated over and over again, while Kaiser remained silent on stage, his leather face turning this way and that, as if scanning the faces below for someone to attack. Sharon spotted a hand signal between Kaiser and Mr. X. Then, with the audience in a near frenzy, the music stopped dead. No power cut this time, just silence through the crowd. Kaiser threw back his head and opened his mouth wide, but still no sound came. Instead, red liquid welled up from the hole in the mask and spilt over his jaw, pouring down his chest and onto the stone platform. Mr. X had now disappeared. Concealed by the smoke, his exit left nothing but the black leather man, covered in fake blood. The crowd continued to watch in silence as Kaiser descended again into the tomb. But when he'd gone, there was an odd reaction. Those standing shoulder to shoulder at the front began swearing angrily and throwing bottles. Sharon saw Flack make a quick movement with his hand, but she couldn't see who he was signalling to.
"What about the sodding show?"
someone kept yelling. It was a bloke Sharon recognised from the cover of Yeller. He wore big white sunglasses, and his hair was pulled up into 3 long spikes on his forehead, like a crown. Flack was working his way forward along the branch, till he was practically over the stage. Then, in what seemed to be a single movement, he jumped down, raised his arm in the air, and a deafening crack rang out. He blew across the barrel of the gun he was holding, then let out a sudden laugh as a crow walloped down on some people in the crowd. That didn't look as if it was planned. It certainly wasn't mentioned in the run-through yesterday. He picked up a microphone.
"All right then, time to wrap up. Who wants to give us a hand?"
Sharon wondered if this was when she was supposed to come out, but she hesitated.
"Come on!"
Flack raised his voice to a shout.
"Don't just stand there! I want to know who's up for a little bit of an experiment."
He walked to the edge and bent over it, eyeballing the front line of his audience.
"Scared to get your fingers burnt, are you?"
The bloke who'd led the yelling a few minutes ago came forward, jumping onto one of the crates, and from there to the stage. As he raised his arms in mock triumph, collecting the cheers of the audience, Sharon knew he was the plant. She hadn't met him at the run-through, but she'd been told about him. Beneath her, she saw the roadies pulling the lids off the crates and throwing them aside to reveal the contents. Chains in one, rags in the other. One of the men picked up an armful of the rags and tossed it high in the air, creating a giant arc of twisted bandages, which Flack caught at the other end. He began hauling in the knotted strip, hand over hand, till it was all in a pile beside him. Then they passed the empty crate up to him, and he placed it, ready for action. When he looked up at her and yelled out her name, Sharon was ready. She edged along the branch, made the jump to the stage, and stood there looking out over the sea of faces. It was a buzz. Flack had the crowd with him now, because they knew something was going to happen. And the smart-ass who'd come to take the challenge was the one they were sneering at. Flack walked around him.
"It's all right."
He smacked him on the shoulder.
"We're going to get on like a house on fire, you and me. What's your name?" "Rollo!" someone yelled out. "Don't be nervous, Rollo."
He brought the mic close to his mouth and looked out over the audience.
"Here goes then. This is a demo of what we call the wick effect. First, we have to make a human candle."
He turned to Sharon.
"Come on then, let's get him wrapped up."
She'd found the end of the strip, like she'd been told, and started to wind it round Rollo's legs. But he broke out into a frenzy of kicking that forced her to retreat. Flack dropped the mic and grabbed him from behind by the elbows, but Rollo pitched forward, throwing Flack over his head. Rollo scooped up the mic.
2-0, he said into it, "which means it's you gets to be the candle."
"Fine with me." Flack gave Sharon the nod, and she started to wind again, from the ankles upwards. When she got to the hips, where she'd have to start binding his hands and arms in, Flack asked for a cigarette.
"Just stick it in my mouth," he said, "and let him there have a go at the winding."
Rollo was obviously practised at the job, and showing he was enjoying it, playing the clown with grimaces and pogo jumps as he went round, till from the neck down, Flack looked like an Egyptian mummy. He was still smoking. Sharon took the fag out to let him exhale and stuck it back in. Instructions were that when the body was bound up to the neck, they had to get it into the crate, and this was supposed to be done in a particular way. She looked over the side to check that the 3 men down there were ready. Then she gave the signal. They threw a length of chain up over the branch, and she caught the end and hauled it in. The 2 men below kept hold of the other end and moved around to the front, so the crowd could see what they were doing. Sharon saw Flack and Rollo look at each other. Flack gave a little sideways flick of his head. Obviously, these two had a lot more worked out than she'd been privy to, so she got on with her own job. Flack had taught her how to put one hand in the way when the chains were being wound around the back to create just a bit of give. And the main ridges had to be at the hips and shoulders, where the biggest bones were. Rollo wasn't interfering with any of that, because he was too busy sending the whole thing up and making a show of it, whirling the end of the chain round like a helicopter propeller, and yelling out, "London's boning! London's boning!" which prompted a chorus of "Fire! Fire! Fire! Fire!" Soon the chorus took over, so all you could hear was a mass of rhythmic yelling, "Fire! Fire! 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 Fire!" Sharon tried to catch Flack's eye. He didn't respond, but as she was getting the padlock into position, he took a deep breath, inflating his chest like he did in the practice session. So it must be still all right. Snapping the lock shut, she raised her hand, and the roadies began to pull. People in the crowd got the idea, caught hold of the end of the chain, and added their force. On the third heave, Flack left the ground, swinging free about a foot above the roof of the tomb. On the next, he was jerked up another 3 feet, and his head would have hit the branch if he hadn't ducked it just in time. Now all they had to do was get him down in the right place. Don't move the box. That was the number one thing Flack had told her. No matter what, don't move the box. If the body doesn't swing level with it, you have to push it to the right place and guide it down. Flack was actually hanging a good 2 feet to the left of it right now, and it would be a job to get him over that far on her own. Rollo was drumming with his fists on the edge of the crate. She grabbed his arm, dragged him away from the crate, and pointed upwards. And as the chain slackened to lower the body again, he gave it an almighty shove. The men on the ground, with perfect timing, let go, and Flack dropped right on target into the crate. "All right," he said. "Where's my face?" Sharon reached into the crate, pulled out the floppy mask, and struggled to get it over Flack's head and correctly in place around the eyes and mouth. She stood back to check it, and a corpse face stared back, its mouth working. Rollo bent in to the mic to address the crowd. "I think our friend's trying to say something. What does he want then?" "He wants another smoke," a voice yelled back. "Give him a light." Laughter. Sharon put a cigarette in the mouth and threw the box of matches across to Rollo, who approached one step at a time, lighting matches and tossing them in the air. "Here comes a candle to light you to bed," he chanted as he lit another match. What happened next hadn't been covered in the practice session, and Sharon wasn't prepared. A fierce blaze of light came at her, followed by a wall of heat that nearly knocked her over. For a few seconds she was blinded, then everything was a grey blur, with clots of luminous black swimming across it, and it was a couple of minutes before she could really make out the scene before her. The first thing she saw was the box, its edges still flaming, and inside it the square shape of the trapdoor open to the darkness below. So the escape had worked. The crowd was stomping and chanting as Rollo started the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and right on cue, Flack, barefaced again, rose up through the trapdoor. He stretched out his arms draped with chains and burning rags, and was greeted by a chorus of yells and cheers. Holding one arm up to call for silence, he stepped aside from the remains of the wooden crate as new clouds of smoke came pouring up from below, and slowly another bandaged mummy rose amid the orange clouds, complete with rubber demon mask. Flack ordered the other two off the stage, and Sharon watched from below as he struck a match and placed it in the demon's open mouth. For a few long seconds, nothing seemed to happen. Then a spear of flame rose above the thing's head. Its face blackened and caved in. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air, and with a violent roaring sound, the whole body exploded into flames. Chapter 30. Bryony left the hospital, feeling numb. It was a shock to see Macready like that, and not just because of his physical condition. The trauma had got to him emotionally. She just wasn't prepared for that. She walked fast, battling to get her thoughts reorganized. For the past 5 years, she realized, Macready had represented for her the epitome of mental clarity and personal control. Maybe there was a touch of hero worship in there, but she wasn't the only one in the Met who'd admit to that. And unlike others who traded the stories about him, she'd seen him at work close up and seen all sides of him. She'd witnessed the bursts of temper, the capricious personal judgments, the plain doggedness of his round-the-clock work when a case bit hard. But one thing she'd never seen in him was fear. Anxiety, yes, but fear, never. Well, he was out of action, for quite a while by the looks. So where did that leave the inquiry? If DCS Fletcher was taking over, he was no substitute for Macready. There was no substitute for Macready, full stop. No one else had his sixth sense of who to rely on for what, where to focus attention and where to take shortcuts, how to drive right into the heart of a case. What was the word he'd used just now? A calling. We're the ones called to know the darkness and find ways to fence it in. Without thinking about where she was heading, Bryony found she'd walked straight towards Lucan Place. All right, that was it. What was the point of pretending to be on holiday? The station was suspiciously quiet. There were only 2 cars in the parking lot and a lone sergeant at the desk talking on the phone. She waved, but when he saw her, he looked flustered and covered the mouthpiece with his hand.
Inspector Williams, the DCS told me to look out for you. He wants a powwow. He wagged a finger. I think you might be in hot water, coming back from your holidays like that. Excuse me, will you? He returned to his phone call, and Bryony walked on down the corridor towards Fletcher's office, preparing a little speech in her head. "Sit down, Bryony," he said. "I was wondering where you'd got to. About to send out the search party, as a matter of fact. If you're going to be in London, you'll have to make your whereabouts known at all times. The ACC's deputy has been on the phone this morning, DAC Chalmers, and his recommendation to me was to send you away again. I can see that, short of bundling you into a paddy wagon, we're not going to achieve that objective." They exchanged brief, cold smiles. "But as far as your personal safety is concerned, you're going to have to cooperate with the protection unit, and to start with, they won't let you stay in your flat." "I've already sorted that out, sir. I've got a hotel room in Cadogan Square." "The officers from the PU will assess it for security. Contact them right away, will you, and give them the details. Chalmers will be coming here later this afternoon to give a briefing. I suppose you'll want to be in on that? Yes, I thought so. In here at 4. As Bryony started opening the stack of mail that had come in during her absence, she was called back to Fletcher's office, where Steve was already apparently in earnest conversation with the DAC. Chalmers had the bulldog look of an old-style policeman with an overlarge head, thick neck, and big shoulders. He sat forward in the plastic armchair, holding a Trilby hat between his meaty hands, and didn't smile in response to her greeting. "You better have a seat," he said. "There's something I have to tell you." She perched on the edge of a chair and glanced at Steve, whose expression indicated that he knew what was coming. "I've just come from the hospital," Chalmers continued. "Commander Macready's had a bit of a relapse. Breathing difficulties. They've had to put him back on the respirator." "What's the problem?" "Heart's not coping too well." He stared into his hat. "He's strong, Macready, and exceptionally fit for his age, which might have caused us to be a bit too optimistic about his recovery rate, given what happened." He put a fist to his mouth and cleared his throat, then looked meaningfully into the Trilby. "As you probably know, he and I had a few discussions about the previous incident at his house, which we suspect is related. From a forensic point of view, that's certainly not an assumption we can make, but Macready himself is convinced there's a connection.
The words came slowly, and Bryony was already fidgeting. Surely it wasn't necessary to go back to square one like this. She suppressed the impulse to interrupt as Fletcher took up the thread. Which means we have to consider that the threat to you two is our primary concern. So we need to introduce a few additional precautionary measures. Steve, who had never suppressed an urge to interrupt, cut in. Of course, sir, but I hope we can avoid anything that might hamper our effectiveness in the investigation, since we're the ones who know the background on this. And there is evidently a complex psychological dimension to the attacks. In fact, I have a suggestion to make. She could see he had them listening, and was half resentful, half relieved, as she watched him take over the agenda. He was proposing a second eyeball-to-eyeball with the walker in Brixton, this time with Bryony also present, to see what the reaction is. Steve had done some work as a consultant in Brixton, and he was now spinning a whole mini-lecture about the relevance of behavioural analysis in a case like this. When the spiel was finished, Chalmers gave his hat a half-turn and put it on his head.
"Well," he said, "I dare say you two will be safe enough in Brixton for an hour or two. I'll talk to the prison governor, see if he's agreeable."
Chapter 31. Aidan made a wide circuit of the concert area, watching the crowd disperse, and taking photos of the mausoleum and its surrounds from different vantage points. But the light was fading, and he wanted to keep some of the flashbulbs for the inside of the tomb. By the time the last people had gone, it was practically dark at ground level beneath the trees, though the sky still showed a luminous white. Crows wheeled across it, carking into the silence as he crouched over the dead one Flack had managed to shoot. The idea of bagging it and taking it back to leave in the wardrobe for collection made him laugh briefly. He photographed it and left it to lie there in peace till the Sockos got to it. Was he really alone now, in Highgate Cemetery at dusk? He must be off his rocker, considering all those stories about the thing with red eyes that came looming up and stared at you with malicious intent.
"Let's get this over and done with,"
he muttered to himself as he headed towards the mausoleum. The door was left open, and his torch showed nothing at first but an empty space, with some rubbish scattered on the earthen floor. He put the torch down and attached the camera flash, which illuminated the walls blackened from the smoke. They were lined with inscribed stone slabs. 18 years old. He rests with God. Age 32, beloved mother of Andrew, Mary and Louise. Taken by the angels after 7 days in this world. What did the angels think about all these tribals messing about on their turf, disturbing the peace? Aidan put his gloves on, then trained the torch beam at a heap of stuff on the floor, and crouched to get a closer look. He bagged some fragments of the charred rags and scattered ash, some pieces of chain, and samples from a spilt bottle of blood capsules. They'd have to get the forensics in here, so it was important to keep disturbance to a minimum. But he scraped a sample of discoloured earth near the wall behind the door. Inspecting it in the palm of his glove, he saw that it was the colour of blood. No doubt the capsules were responsible, but it was best to be sure. At the back of the hut, there were stone steps going down. Aidan felt a trickle of sweat breaking from his scalp as he planted his foot on the first of them. The torch beam revealed coffins stacked 3 deep in racks along the walls. Old caskets that were musty and mouldy and caving in with rot. In one corner, the upper rack had collapsed into the coffin underneath, bursting it open so the head and shoulders of a half-decomposed body hung out, the hollow of its eyes seeming to stare right at him. Aidan stared back for long enough to get a good photo, then moved further in, keeping the torch beam low. Sure enough, there were more stairs that led further down. This was the only way the performers could have got in and out. The idea of going down there now wasn't in the least appealing, and he had a weird feeling he wasn't alone. Deciding this was definitely a job for the Sockos, he turned and stumbled back up, out into the night, and took deep gasps from the rising breeze. Once he'd found the right path, he kept the torch beam steadily trained in front of him. If there was some 10-foot duppy around here with staring red eyes, it was going to be seriously ignored. He was watching for the landmarks he'd identified on the way in, the fallen branch to the right of the path, the 3 identical gravestones to the left, the burnt-out tree that looked as if it had been struck by lightning. As he threw his leg over the bike and the old motor choked noisily into action, Aidan knew for certain there had been somebody or something back there watching him. There was nothing he wanted more right now than to be in amongst the parade of glaring headlights on the main road. It was like plunging into an embrace of life and movement, joining a stream of people who knew who they were and where they were going. That was not a good situation back there. He'd seen conjuring acts before, but mainly with little tricks involving handkerchiefs and playing cards. Nothing like that crazy exhibition. What was scarifying, though, was not the craziness, but the skill. By the time he got back to Chelsea, it was past 10 o'clock, but maybe still not too late to knock up Jimmy Chapman. And the more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that was the best thing to do. He could phone the doc from there and tell him to get the Sockos out to Highgate fast. Jimmy answered the door straight away.
"Funny," he said. "I had a feeling you might show up tonight."
He led Aidan through the shop to a back room set up as an office, with a desk and filing cabinet.
"Park yourself there while I get you something. You look as if you could do with a bit more than a cup of tea, but that'll have to do you for the time being. I'm not much of a drinking man these days, so I don't keep any on the premises. Had anything to eat? I could rustle you up a couple of sausages and some chips. How would that be?"
"That will be dead righteous, Mr. Chapman."
"Jimmy, got some pictures for me?"
Aidan put the camera on the table and fished the rolls of film out of his jacket.
"How soon can you get them done?"
"Tomorrow."
Jimmy put the film in a storage cylinder and wrote on the label,
"I'll get that fry-up underway."
"Could I use your telephone?"
"Course."
Jimmy pulled the phone across the desk and handed him the receiver.
"I'll leave you to it. Kitchen's just above."
He pointed upwards.
"Come and find me when you're done."
Aidan knew that the doc was in the habit of working late, so he tried the office number first, but it rang out. So he tried him at home and got the same result. He went over to look at the photos on the wall opposite. They were family snapshots. Jimmy holding a baby, a toddler larking about on a plastic motorbike, Jimmy and his wife with the toddler and a spindly little girl on the seafront, their hair blown by the wind. Hunky-dory, if that was the sort of life you wanted. But it wasn't Aidan's idea of his future. The family would be in bed, so he climbed the stairs as quietly as he could and knocked lightly on what must be the kitchen door. Jimmy opened it with a frying pan in one hand, then used the other to pull out a chair from the kitchen table.
"Sit yourself down, Nick. You look like you've been spending too much time on the seamy side, mate. How's it going?"
Aidan slumped onto his elbows, propping his head on one hand.
"Can't get on to Doc Latham."
"Well, it's late for that, isn't it?"
Jimmy used a fork to discipline a sausage that was spitting violently.
"I can help you chase him up if it's urgent. What's getting your goat?"
"I'm not being properly briefed, that's what. Doc Latham's giving me information on a drip feed and I don't like that. It's a lack of respect, know what I mean?"
"Oh, yes,"
Jimmy shot back, with an expressive tilt of the head.
"That's Steve for you. Thinks he knows best and likes to keep you tagging along behind. You heard about what happened to Macready?"
"Sort of. It's the background I need to know."
"All right, let's get the tea sorted first, shall we?"
Jimmy reached for the teapot from the dresser beside him and filled 2 mugs.
"Sugar?"
Aidan tipped 3 spoonfuls into the caramel-coloured brew. He could never understand the appeal of tea, but if you sweetened it enough and drank it fast, it was better than nothing. The sausages, though, were good. He ate fast, while Jimmy showed him the newspaper report about the attack on Macready. There wasn't much to go on from his own point of view. It wasn't at all clear what, if anything, it had to do with the tribals and their ways of amusing themselves, but Jimmy finished up with a warning.
Better watch your step. Keep your eyes skinned and your doors locked.
Aidan pushed his empty plate aside.
As if we need any more paranoids in this malarkey.
He slumped further in his chair, relaxing at last, and began to give an account of the day, using the recap to focus some of the details in his own mind. Jimmy's questions were good. He knew what to home in on.
So this front man of those Flack, he's ex-Vaudeville?
That's what I was told. D.R. Williams got some background on him from one of the club owners.
I used to get taken to the music hall when I was a kid, Jimmy said. They'd split your sides laughing 1 minute and scare you rigid the next. I can see how this fits in a way. But the one who's the singer sounds like he's in a different show.
I suppose you're right in a way. It's a sort of pre-show. Flack's almost turned the rest of the Suddens into a supporting act, which probably explains why Kaiser's got his dander up.
Kaiser's the singer?
Yeah. Wears SS regalia and has a swastika tattooed into the side of his scalp. But there's a few signs he's busting at the seams. I've only got this second-hand, mind. I've been looking for an opportunity to talk to him myself, see if I can collect some of the spill, but I haven't seen him round. And there's somebody else I haven't seen.
Aidan frowned, studying his hands.
Somebody who might have asked too many questions for his own good. I should be updating Doc Latham on that. Besides which, I have to make sure they know to send the Socko team up there to the cemetery before the wildlife eats all the evidence. I need my reporting arrangements sorted out. Seriously, man.
You want me to have a word with the DCS?
Fletcher?
He shrugged dismissively. Jimmy winked.
I could feed in the suggestion that a chat between you and D.R. Williams might be a good idea at this point.
Chapter 32. It was after 11 when Bryony was dropped back at the hotel. Her limbs felt heavy as she climbed the stairs, and she had a moment of dizziness when she reached the top. She stared at the door of room 25, which had been fitted with a new steel double lock of disproportionate size. The gleaming metal looked ridiculously conspicuous against the aged wood of the door, which was badly in need of a coat of paint. What was the point, she thought, as she inserted the key she'd been issued with and heard the sharp chock when the bolt was released? What was the point of all that, seeing one good kick would probably take the whole door off its hinges? But as she closed it behind her, she saw new hinges had indeed been fitted. The window was bolted too, so it could be opened no more than 4 inches, and a telephone had been installed on the little table by the wall. She dropped onto the narrow bed and waited for her thumping heartbeat to let up. It's only a few stairs, she told herself. Surely that's not too much to ask of your system when you're barely past your 33rd birthday. It was probably just that her period was due. That did funny things to her circulation sometimes. But maybe there was something else the matter with her heart, making it feel tight and heavy. Isn't that where it's supposed to get you when you bust up with the only person in the world you want to spend your life with? Would Gareth be feeling like this? She thought of the look on his face as they'd parted, and he'd let her go without even coming to the station to say goodbye properly. So why did he ring last night? A change of heart? What did that mean? Bryony found she was crying, the tears coursing steadily down her cheeks and dropping onto her hands. Stupid, stupid, stupid. It didn't have to be like this. It was only a stupid misunderstanding. What happened last night was a joke that only needed an explanation. It would be 12:20 a.m. in Paris now, and Gareth would almost certainly have gone to bed. But surely that was all the more reason to try a call now. The little grey telephone they'd put on the desk would be tapped, but too bad. She dialed the number and waited, trying to calm the thudding in her chest. But there was no reply. She slept badly and woke several times before calling it quits at 6 a.m. and drawing the curtain to let in the early light. All through the night she'd been talking to Gareth in her head, then writing him letters. She looked through her handbag and found she still had an unused aerogram. The words poured out. along with the tears. She said she was so sorry that she broke up the holiday, but that she had no choice. She told him about Macready, and explained why Steve had been at her flat on Monday night, just editing the truth a little bit to emphasize that it was Steve who was in danger, and playing down the reasons for her move to the hotel. She pleaded with him to ring her, and gave him the new phone number and the address. She signed the letter with kisses, sealed it up, dropped it in her bag, and went out to post it, feeling a whole lot better. Bryony loved the London streets at this time, in the first stirrings of the day, when the light was new and the breeze ran free down the streets, where cars travelled singly with discreet intervals between them. The birds acted as if they were in control of the world, reminding you that a new day was a new start. A feeling it was important to catch when you were on a case that stayed with you day and night. Something had invaded her life, railroaded everything she depended on, and was now depriving her of the freedom of the streets. Well, there was no one here to stop her going for a morning run, was there? She deposited the letter in a postbox at the end of the street, noting that it would make the first collection time of the day in just 10 minutes, then sprinted back to the hotel and up the stairs, breathing evenly as she counted the flights. But again she came over dizzy as she reached the top. She had a quick shower in the funny little alcove with a sliding door at the end of the landing, and slipped back into her room as the phone was ringing. DCS Fletcher. "Just wanting to make sure you're all right," he said. "The appointment at Brixton is confirmed for 11:30. You'll be collected from Lucan Place at 11. How are you going to get to work?" "I can walk, sir. It's only 10 minutes from here." "I'd prefer you didn't. Leonie will fetch you in half an hour." Bryony put the phone down and stared at it. This was starting to get on her wick. Lured by the smell of frying bacon, she found her way to the basement dining room and ordered breakfast, her thoughts working rapidly as she waited for it to be served. There was so much to catch up on from the time she'd been away, and it occurred to her that she'd heard almost nothing of Aidan's activities. Obviously, the best way of getting up to date was to talk to him herself, but she couldn't do that now without Fletcher's authority, and going through all the blather of protocols and security arrangements. All the same, a smile crept over Bryony's face. There was nothing to stop her having a talk with Jimmy Chapman, was there? Knowing Jimmy, chances were he'd picked up a fair bit about what was going on with Aidan. Jimmy had been involved in the Walker case too, as photographer on the Socco team. And although there was no reason to think he'd be at risk himself, it was probably a good idea to tell him some of the background to the attack on Macready. She got Leonie to drop her at Jimmy's shop, and had to go through the absurdity of making another arrangement to be collected, though the place was only a short walk along the main road from the police station. Leonie said she'd wait in the car. Bryony hadn't seen Jimmy for a couple of years, and although he was instantly recognisable when he came to the door, she felt she was being greeted by a different person from the one she'd known. The Jimmy who always looked like an out-of-place teenager darting about the corridors of the Vine Street station, who used to joke about his own risk of slipping through the cracks in the floorboards, was slipping instead towards middle-aged solidity.
"Bryony Williams,"
he beamed at her with obvious pleasure.
"Or do I have to call you Ma'am these days? I suppose you've been shinning up the career ladder at a rate of knots. You got my message then?"
"What message?"
"I rang Chelsea Station this morning and asked to speak to you, but they said you hadn't arrived yet."
Bryony tapped her forehead. "Must be ESP. I haven't been to the station yet. You know what they say about great minds? Better see how alike we've been thinking, hadn't we?" He showed her into the office at the back of the shop, and they sat at his work table.
"Aidan was round here last night," he said, "delivering some photos. I got the impression he's not too chipper."
"You think he doesn't like the assignment?"
"No, actually. I'd say he's deeply involved in the assignment. He says he's frustrated with his reporting arrangements."
"Steve," she rolled her eyes. Yeah, well, Aidan said he wants to talk to you. So we are thinking alike. Hang on, Bryony, I haven't finished. I said I'd mention it to Fletcher, which I did. I rang him a little while ago and got the leave it with me routine. So I don't know if it's worth giving him a gentle push from your end. All this manoeuvring just to talk to someone who was part of my regular team only a couple of weeks ago. I can understand why you left the Met, Jimmy. You said Aidan brought some photos. What's in them?
I'm not strictly supposed to.
Jimmy smiled broadly. Standing up, Bryony smiled back. Let's have a look, shall we? The dark room was a converted laundry behind the house, obviously far too small for the demands of the business. The infrared light revealed a crowded arrangement of tubs and workbenches, with scores of prints hanging from lines across the ceiling. They had to duck under these to get to the bench where Jimmy had laid out the contact sheets from Aidan's rolls of film. He set up the magnifier so Bryony could take a look. The top 2 rows on the first sheet seemed to be all groups of punks, photographed in some kind of heavily wooded area. In the next row, she could make out that it was a cemetery. There were gravestones in some of the shots, and the last row showed a mausoleum with a man standing on the roof, and above it, people sitting on an overhanging tree branch. It was the second sheet that started to get interesting. Bryony peered at the increasingly bizarre sequences of images. A girl winding chains and bandages around the man. The mummy-like figure hoisted into the air, then lowered and apparently set alight. Bryony picked some shots for immediate attention. Jimmy put the first one in the enlarger and adjusted the timer while she waited for the image to be projected onto an easel. Bryony had been with Jimmy a few times when he'd done this, and it was always a strange moment. Although she understood how it worked in principle, there was something mysterious about the way the patches of dark and the light grew on the easel, gradually forming recognisable shapes, bringing that fixed moment of past time into the here and now.
Looks like an execution, Jimmy said, except the victim's a bit too calm and cooperative.
More than that, he's anticipating. See? He's turning towards the girl here like he's giving orders. Then before the rope comes, he's looking up, and he's looking down ready for the drop into the box. But what's wrong with this one? The face has gone out of focus.
No.
Jimmy reset the enlarger for that area of the photograph.
It's a mask. Aidan mentioned they use different sorts of masks in the act.
Did he know? Macready said his attacker wore a mask. Bryony leant in further towards the easel.
It'll be clearer if you lean back, said Jimmy. I'll see if I can isolate that section.
The minutes ticked away. Bryony took another look at the contact sheets, and Jimmy swore intermittently as he tinkered with the negative.
Bingo!
He had projected the grotesque rubber face so it filled the easel.
Halloween mask.
It's more sophisticated than that. Look at the way the features are moulded, all that detail around the eyes and mouth. You know what's bothering me, Jimmy? There's some connection between this clowning act and the attack on Macready. There's got to be. Both of them were silent for a moment, concentrating.
What makes you say that?
He asked.
You got a description of this mask Macready saw?
Bryony hedged. Not exactly. Macready had confused her. For most of their talk, he'd been as precise as ever. But when he described the mask, it was as if he was hallucinating. I want him to see the photo. Soon as you've got a print, I'll get him to look at it. But I'm worried Aidan still hasn't been properly briefed. I was worried all along. See, there've been arson attacks on Macready's place and on Steve's just recently. So what happened to Macready was like the culmination of some plan.
Macready and Steve? Why's that then?
She bit her lip. You ought to be told the whole story. It's to do with the Walker case, which is why you should know.
That animal.
Jimmy's face darkened. Don't insult animals. Look, I can't tell you any more before I've cleared it with the chief super.
or better still with Macready, soon as he's ready to have visitors again. He got you involved in the first place, didn't he?
I should say so. Personal call from the commander's office, 7:30 in the morning, when my youngest was running round the place with no nappy on, watering the fitted carpet upstairs. It's not the first time I've done him a favour of this sort.
I bet it isn't. Jimmy, I need prints of these to show to Macready. When can I get them?
Not before 11. I'll tell you that much.
Stuff it, Jimmy. I'm not going all the way round the mulberry bush on this. Aidan has to be warned, because these guys doing the fire show may be very dangerous. And they may be specifically dangerous to him if they find out that he's CID. Now, where have you got him billeted? It was only as she was leaving that Bryony remembered Leonie was still waiting in the car. I'm sorry, she said, diving into the passenger seat. I didn't expect that to take so long. Gunter Grove we want, and better step on it. I have to be back at the station by 11. As they drew up outside the house, Bryony took note of the vehicles parked nearby. There was no sign of the Vespa Jimmy had mentioned, so Aidan probably wasn't there. Whose was the natty green Renault? She managed a discreet glance through its side window as she passed and registered one of those grotesque little troll figures dangling from the driving mirror.
Cute little car, Leonie commented, standing beside her. Somehow it doesn't look as if it belongs in this street.
Exactly what I was thinking. Keep an eye on the comings and goings, would you? I won't be long in there.
But I'm supposed to be with you at all times. Those were my instructions, direct from the top. I know Jimmy Chapman's was a safe enough port of call, but what's this place?
I said I won't be long, maybe only a few minutes. Jimmy had given her the front door key, but as soon as she entered, she could tell there was somebody in there.
Nick?
She called from the foot of the stairs. A door opened and Ken Keegan appeared.
Is Aidan here? She asked. Afraid not. Haven't seen him. I just came to collect his souvenirs. I didn't realise you were his supervising officer.
And what business is it of yours, she thought, determined at least to take a quick look at Aidan's setup now she was here. She went past him up the stairs. The door was wide open, but she examined the lock on it, which seemed to be an exact replica of the one installed on her hotel room.
We decided to concentrate the security on the room rather than the house, said Ken, watching her from the top of the stairs. One of those things on the front door wouldn't exactly blend in.
You're right there, she laughed. Scanning the room, she noticed that Aidan's few items of clothing were slung over the back of a chair, and the wardrobe door was open. There were some bulging plastic bags on the table. These the goodies? She asked. Bit bulky for forensic samples, aren't they? Any idea where they're from?
Highgate Cemetery, apparently.
She turned one over. He hasn't labelled them. Looks like he needs a bit of coaching on this part of the job. All right, I'll leave you to it. Leonie remained tight-lipped as they drove back to Lucan Place. That suited Bryony. She had to prepare herself for the coming encounter in Brixton Prison. Chapter 33. The interview with Maxwell Tremlay was set up in a room on the ground floor of the cell block, with 2 officers posted outside and a senior warder seated at the back, ready to monitor the proceedings. As Bryony had anticipated, it was a dismal atmosphere in there. Fluorescent glare from the tube embedded in the ceiling bounced off the painted concrete walls, highlighting the scratches on the metal table that was bolted to the floor. It was all sufficiently intimidating to ensure that no one spoke during the few long minutes' wait for the prisoner. Steve, leafing through some notes with a stern expression on his face, looked as if he had a certain familiarity with the conditions, but Bryony was quite unnerved. The walker's arrival was heralded by a succession of clangs in the echoing corridor outside, and at this point the warder smiled and spoke to Bryony.
I hope you feel it's worth the effort, he said. We haven't had a word out of him in months.
The door was thrown open, and a young officer entered,
carrying a small metal-framed chair, which he placed several feet from the table. Then the prisoner was brought in. Bryony registered the trace of a limp in the shuffling feet, the shackled hands, the well-worn prison overalls, and the roughly shaved head of a man who might have been any of the anonymous social rejects harboured in a place like this. He took his time getting seated, as if he were unfamiliar with the apparatus of a chair, and waited till the two guards had withdrawn before raising his head. For a second, Bryony had the illusion of a face floating in the space in front of her, its contours chiselled by the harsh light from above, the mouth set, the eyes looking out from somewhere far back in the skull. Was he looking at her or through her? His presence made her feel so exposed that the distinction was meaningless. "Thank you for coming to talk to us, Max." Steve's tone was practised and even. "This needn't take long. I'd like you to look at something." He extracted a copy of Yella from among his papers and got up to hand it over, but was swiftly intercepted by the warder, who took it from him and held it out to Tremlay. There was no response. It was as if the person in front of them neither heard nor saw the manoeuvre. "Would you mind showing him the picture on the back?" Steve said. The warder positioned himself right in front of the prisoner and held the image up. Unable to see Tremlay's face, Bryony found herself staring at his feet. One ankle looked quite badly twisted, and she thought she detected a twitch. But apart from that, they might have been sharing the room with a waxwork. The warder returned the magazine to Steve and sat down. Steve carried on. "Seems you've got fan club of some kind. So naturally, we've been wondering where the inspiration came from." He flicked through the pages of Yella as if he was studying them anew. "They're a colourful bunch, this. Bit of art, bit of philosophy, lots of costume and makeup. They seem to have got the idea they're going to change the world. Take up where you left off." He paused for a few seconds. "I was wondering how you'd feel about that, given you can't do much yourself while you're stuck in here." Another pause. "What do you think of this, for example? Down in the dark satanic mills, where the wheels keep turning over iron grills, don't look now, you'll never see how London's invisible machinery kills." He shut the magazine and looked directly at Tremlay. "Crap, eh? Bit of Blake, touch of Dickens, and a load of old baloney. Are you happy about this lot taking your name in vain? Not to mention your image?" Bryony's eye caught another twitch in the ankle. Steve let the silence grow for a minute, then picked up his chair and moved it to the other side of the desk, about a yard away from Tremlay's. The warder started up as if he was going to intervene, then thought better of it and sat forward, alert for any move. "You see," Steve said, "I think we could probably put a stop to this quite easily if we had some cooperation from the right quarters. I'd say we could stamp it out. It's just that one thing puzzles me." He paused again. "What's puzzling me? And my colleague here, Bryony Williams, I'm sure you remember Bryony, don't you, Max? What we've been unable to figure out is how this bunch of scumbags got hold of your photograph. Can you help us with that?" Bryony was used to the silence technique, which was a favourite of Macready's. But this felt like the longest silence she'd ever experienced. Steve stayed where he was, his eyes fixed on Tremlay. The warder was in agonies at the back of the room, suppressing a succession of coughs and fidgets, and in her own eyes the face of the waxwork seemed to become airborne again, staring at her from some deep void. At last Steve said quietly, "That's disappointing. Ah, well, Max,
Better let you get back to whatever you've got to get back to. Tremlay was escorted out, and as the door closed behind him, Steve gave an expansive mock sigh.
At least we tried, he said, pulling out his cigarette packet. So what's your take on it, Bryony? Not like you to stay out of play like that?
I dunno. Bryony was still staring at the empty chair. It wasn't what I expected.
The silence, you mean?
Steve exchanged glances with the warder, offering him a cigarette.
You were warned about that?
Of course I expected the silence, she shot back. It's just he seemed so completely evacuated somehow.
Steve gave a mirthless laugh. Well, don't you remember that theory they were running on the tabloids? The walker's a spirit on the move, between one host personality and the next. Maybe he's moved on.
That's a dangerous idea. It only needs the wrong person to take it too seriously, and you can get exactly the situation we're facing now.
So you think Tremlay's got nothing to do with it?
Bryony was genuinely puzzled.
I wouldn't say that exactly.
There was silence for a few seconds. Then the warder said, "Would you mind if I had a look at the magazine again?" He took it from Steve and turned through the pages. "We had one of these in here before. Not the same picture on the back. We'd have picked up on that, obviously. But it was the same magazine. One of the men was reading it during some recreational activity, and it was confiscated. Do you want me to see if I can find it?" He was gone for a good 20 minutes, but returned with a cellophane bag containing some yellow paper. "Here you are. Yellow. That's it, isn't it?" He read the tag. "Confiscated 24th of May this year during an art class. Property of prisoner number 582, Patrick Mulligan. But the man who was actually reading it was Lenny Dignall." The penny dropped very noisily in Bryony's mind, and she gave herself a hard smack on the side of the head. "Ow!" said Steve. "I could feel that from here. What's up?"
There's another case involving Dignall. I'll tell you about it in the car. She turned back to the warder. Any idea who brought the thing into Brixton in the first place? Can we talk to Mulligan?
"He's been transferred to Pentonville. We're overcrowded here, and he's classified low risk."
Do you know if he had visitors while he was here?
"2, on a regular basis. His mother's a bit doolally, if you know what I mean, and his brother usually came with her on visits. My best guess would be that it's him brought the literature." "Mind if we take this with us?" asked Steve, holding up the magazine. On the way back to Lucan Place, Bryony filled Steve in on Lenny Dignall. "The case of the Battersea Foot," he said. "I like it. Has a sort of Sherlock Holmes ring to it. So where are they at with the investigation?"
As if I'd know, Steve. C1 don't report to me. Dennis was supposed to be helping them with BD follow-ups, so we could ask if they've sent him on any errands.
He looked at her suspiciously. "But there's more to this than meets the eye, isn't there? What have you done to deserve that smack on the head you gave yourself?"
I should have put 2 and 2 together before now. It's been staring me in the face. According to the coroner's report, the Battersea foot, well, the lower leg actually, is jarred. They thought it might have been some kind of misfired cremation, so I sent Dennis and Aidan on the run around looking at incinerators. Then Pavan said it could be spontaneous combustion.
Steve guffawed.
"He said what?"
Spontaneous combustion. He was dead serious. But anyway, I should have connected it up with this fire show thing, shouldn't I? Pyromaniacs and burnt body parts. There just has to be a connection.
"Not necessarily."
But as they turned into Lucan Place, he said, "Look, I suppose you're about to get hot on the trail of the Battersea Foot, so just a bit of strategic advice. Let's follow the lead our end first and see where it takes us. We might progress a bit faster that way."
Agreed. But I can't just sit on the evidence of what could be a vital connection between the cases.
Of course not. What you do is cover yourself by reporting it to Fletcher and rely on him to leave it on the back burner. Trust me, he will.
It was good advice, she had to admit. Bryony got out, leaving Steve to drive back to Paddington Green.
She walked into the station trying to sort out what she needed to report to Fletcher from the morning's confusing trawl of information. But things weren't as she expected in that quarter either. Fletcher's greeting was oddly subdued. He listened passively to her account of the session with Tremlay, giving only a token nod when she suggested that someone ought to follow up on the question of how a copy of Yella had got into Brixton, and why it had ended up in the hands of Lenny Dignall. "Thank you. Is there anything else you want to discuss?"
Aidan Silvera, sir.
She was aware she needed to choose her words carefully.
I've heard he needs more background to help him pick up on the right leads, and I thought...
Fletcher cut her off. "You've been talking to Jimmy Chapman." She blushed.
Yes, as a matter of fact.
"Given the changed circumstances, I'm taking over Aidan's supervision myself."
Changed circumstances?
That was when she twigged. He was holding off on some bad news. When he picked up the phone and asked for tea to be brought in, she knew it for certain, and what it must be about. But sitting there with her mouth dry and taut, she found she couldn't ask. So they waited for the tea to arrive, staring out of the window at the sun on the houses opposite. "I've had a phone call from the hospital," he said at last. "I know you had a close working relationship with the commander when you were on his team at Vine Street. So I thought you'd want to be kept informed of his condition." There was a pause. "Commander Macready's had complications. He's suffered a collapse of the lung, medical condition known as tension pneumothorax, and it's serious. To be straight with you, Bryony, he's not expected to—" Bryony replaced her cup on its saucer with excessive care, then found herself standing up. "Thanks. Thank you, sir." She left the room, marched down the corridor and straight through the front door. Voices were raised behind her, and someone caught her arm. Leonie. "Excuse me, Mum, but I've been asked to—" Bryony rounded on her. "I know exactly what you've been asked to do, DC Hendricks. I'm going to the hospital, and I don't want any minders of any description trailing after me. Is that understood?" Chapter 34. The hours passed. Bryony sat in the waiting room for much of the time, taking an occasional trip down to the cafeteria for a change of scene and a mug of tea that she left to go cold. When she saw staff looking at her and exchanging glances, she buried her head in a magazine. Not that she could read anything. She stared blankly at the dog-eared, glossy pages with their endless parade of women in kooky caps and boots. Sometime in the afternoon she saw Chalmers walk through in earnest discussion with a doctor, and was relieved that he didn't look in her direction. When Steve turned up, she was glad to see him. "What have you heard?" she asked. "Nothing much. Only just found out. Been trying to get another hotel room because Pavan won't let me back in my flat. He should be here any minute, gathering of the clans." "What about Macready's family? He must have some relatives." "Well, he's always been cagey about his personal life, but I know there was a divorce about 10 years ago, and he has a son who works for Oxfam. Macready's secretary has been trying to contact him, but he's in India, and I gather the communication lines aren't very good." She looked over towards the desk, where things seemed to have gone quiet for a while, and the attendant was engaged in paperwork. "You know, I was thinking, this collapse of Macready's must have happened while we were at Brixton, sitting in the same room as the Walker." "Don't think about it, Bryony. Just don't think about it. Anyway, Macready's tough as old boots. Concentrate on that thought instead." "Do you know anything about this condition? What's it called? Tension something or other?" "Tension pneumothorax is the person to ask. Pavan." Pavan moved one of the yellow plastic armchairs so it faced them, creating a small enclave in the corner of the waiting room. He arranged his long legs in the ridiculously low seat and made a face.
Who designs these chairs? The human body was never meant to be positioned at such angles, and you know what happens to that stuff in a fire.
He pointed to the mustard-coloured foam bulging out through a slit on the edge of Steve's chair. "We're hoping you can tell us about tension pneumothorax," said Bryony. He leant over, opened his briefcase, and took out a large white envelope, which he laid on his knees.
It's probably best if I explain in relation to these. I've been studying Macready's X-rays. These are the ones taken when he was first admitted, so they don't show the current state of his lung, but my responsibility is to identify the nature of the injuries.
Steve cut him short.
What's the weapon, then? I can tell you what it isn't. It isn't a knife, or any other weapon with a blade. The wounds are punctures.
Stiletto? Steve was reaching for the envelope, but Pavan kept it firmly under his hand.
I think not. My best conjecture, on the basis of what I can see here, he tapped the envelope, is a skewer of some kind, possibly a meat skewer, though most meat skewers are shorter and thicker than the instrument we're looking for. I'm more inclined to think.
He drew out 2 X-ray plates and handed one to Steve and one to Bryony.
That's a front view through the chest, he said to Steve, and to Bryony, that's the back view.
She studied the image in front of her, then looked over at the one Steve was holding. "There are 2 chest wounds," she said, "as well as the one in the throat. 3 altogether. I thought he'd been stabbed twice. That's what he reported, isn't it?"
"Exactly," said Pavan. "The second thrust has gone right through the lung, creating an exit wound in the lung tissue. The rib here has prevented the instrument from coming out on the other side of the body. I'm inclined to think that the weapon in question is a bicycle spoke. My guess is that this second wound wasn't spotted when Macready was originally assessed by the medical team. It's lower down and quite tiny, but may have opened since. It's in a particularly dangerous spot, anatomically speaking. A tension pneumothorax can occur when air is trapped in or around the lung, which in some cases can also affect the working of the heart. When that happens, it's a critical condition."
Staring at the black and white forms on the plate, Bryony felt a wave of nausea rising, tingling at the back of her neck, then swooping down into her stomach. She turned her face and looked out of the window, breathing steadily and willing herself back into control. Pavan gathered up the X-ray plates and got to his feet.
"Macready's in good hands. I know Albrecht a little from my time in Cambridge. He's the leading consultant surgeon in the field. Supposed to have been called back from a conference in Paris this morning. It's possible he'll be willing to talk to me. I'll go and try my luck."
Steve and Bryony sat in silence for a few minutes, until Steve said,
"I feel completely useless, you know, like a spare prick at a wedding."
"That's a strange choice of metaphor."
"You know what I mean. You plough on in your work, assuming you're doing something useful, vital even. Then you find yourself in a situation like this, and you wish you spent your life training for something completely different. It's all in their hands now, isn't it? The White Coat Brigade. I could wish I was in there myself with the scalpel, making the life-saving cut."
"It's not our calling, Steve."
"What's that supposed to mean?"
"Something Macready said to me when I went to see him yesterday." She was about to try and explain, but noticed some new activity around the desk on the other side of the room. Several nurses had converged and were talking to the receptionist. Then one of them, senior to the others, judging by the extra stiff and starchy way she carried herself, turned and looked at Bryony directly. There was something terribly inevitable, then, about the way this woman crossed the room, took the chair Pavan had occupied, and faced Steve and Bryony.
"You're Commander Macready's friends, is that right?"
She glanced at a notepad.
"Bryony Williams and Stephen Latham? We've had a team in there doing everything possible.
The nurse paused to take a breath. But Bryony was unable to breathe at all as she heard the words that followed. "I'm sorry. I'm very sorry." Chapter 35. Sharon wasn't used to eating curry because her lovely stepdad classified it as foreign muck. Actually, she didn't like it all that much, but she was hungry and hadn't eaten a hot meal for the best part of a week. Zig was a regular here, so the people in the restaurant were quite friendly to them and let them in before opening time while they were having their own family meal. The restaurant looked as if it was also their sitting room, with a little television up at the end near the kitchen, and a settee on which 2 small children sat staring at the screen. It was funny being in the same room as a normal family again. This was the first time she and Zig had talked to each other since the concert, because they'd spent last night partying at the cloisters and most of today sleeping off the effects of the stuff they'd taken. In a way, there was no point in talking, because it was perfectly obvious Sol hadn't been part of the act yesterday. There was only Kaiser, Flack, Mr. X, and Rollo. "You didn't tell me about Rollo," she said. "He must be a regular part of the act. That's a slick routine they've got worked out."
He's been in it a couple of times, but he's just an extra. Anybody could do what he does.
"Where does he hang out then? I haven't seen him round the place."
Maybe you have, but he just wasn't done up like that.
"Could be." Sharon crunched on a poppadom. "But you know what my guess is? I think he's Mr. X. No, seriously, it fits. Mr. X goes back down, out of sight. Then this bloke comes out from the crowd, all done up with the spikes and the specs. I could tell he was an insider from the way they were going about things on stage. And besides, Flack's life depends on what that bloke does or doesn't do in the act. He couldn't use just anybody."
"Perhaps you're right,"
said Zig. "You said you wanted me to notice things. Well, I noticed one thing that's got me puzzled. You know the last part of the act, where the dummy comes up? I was looking at how the pulley system works. Flack doesn't need it when he drops down through the roof. He just drops. But what comes up again has to be attached to the pulley system." So, I was watching the blokes at the side there, the ones who pull on the chains. Why did it take all 3 of them to pull up the dummy? What's it stuffed with? Rocks? Aidan was summoned to meet the detective chief super, no less, at a steakhouse on the Fulham Road. Not a place for wearing the kitchen cutlery. He took off the spiked collar and pulled his hair down over his ears, but really it was a waste of effort. There was no chance he could look halfway respectable, not now that he'd cut the sleeves off the jacket and got Highgate mud all over his boots. Well, at least no one was going to be looking at his boots when he was sitting at the table, were they? The traffic on the Fulham Road was dense and bad-tempered in the early evening heat. Aidan crossed the road through a queue of vehicles that were stopped at the lights and provoked an outburst from a cab driver.
"Hey! Bugger off out of it!"
Reaching the pavement opposite, he was confronted by 3 men with their arms folded. Aidan read the indicators rapidly. Shaved heads, outsized boots, rolled-up jeans. But the only thing he really needed to read was the message on one of the T-shirts. White Riot. "You heard what he said," growled one of them, giving Aidan a sideways shove that sent him into collision with the White Riot shirt front. He tried to sidestep, but the 3rd man grabbed his arm and, thrusting his ugly mug up close, said,
"What makes you think you got a right of way here, eh? What makes you think that shite? You spades think you own it, don't you?"
They were elbow to elbow along the curb, edging him back into the now moving stream of traffic.
"Get out of it, shite!"
Aidan spotted a panda car approaching in the outside lane and, staking his chances on the driver's skill at emergency stops, let himself be pushed across its path. It was a fair gamble. The car screeched to a halt, giving him a thump on the hip. He saw the passenger door open, and a uniformed sergeant took his time getting out, wiping the sweat off his face with a handkerchief. Aidan didn't know him. The officer squared his shoulders, stuck out his stomach, and walked around the front of the car.
"What do you think you're doing, chum?" he asked.
Aidan looked him in the eye.
"I think you saw what happened, Sergeant. I was being jostled by those three over there."
He pointed directly at the men, who had retreated against the wall and were watching with smirks on their faces.
"They were pushing me into the road."
The sergeant looked him up and down, his gaze lingering on the muddy boots.
"Were they now? You know what I'd say? I'd say you want to watch where you're going. And if you were to ask my opinion off the record, I'd say you should get back where you belong."
By now, Aidan had memorised the officer's number.
"What's that supposed to mean?"
he said quietly. The sergeant gave a single laugh, like a dog bark.
"Where the bananas come from?"
He got back in the car and left Aidan still facing the three assailants. This time they let him continue on his way, but followed close behind, treading on his heels and making obscene remarks about black bananas. He finally shook them off by outpacing them. He arrived at the restaurant sweating and went to splash his face before fronting up to DCS Fletcher, who was seated in one of the dining booths, separated from each other by high wooden partitions.
"Everything all right?" Fletcher asked immediately. "You look puffed." "Had to tear myself away from some undesirable company."
"Ah, well,
I dare say you've been getting plenty of that."
Fletcher signalled to the waiter, who came over and took their orders. When his half-pint arrived, Aidan felt like draining it immediately, but you couldn't drink too many of those in the company of the chief super, so he had to make it last.
"So, everything's going all right, is it?" Fletcher asked. "Undesirable company permitting." "As it happens, sir, there's a matter of police conduct I'd like to report on. Something that happened on my way here."
"Oh, yes?" Aidan told the story, repeating verbatim the sergeant's remarks, which Fletcher recorded in a little notebook. As the account finished, he closed the book and tapped on the cover with the flat end of the pencil.
"You sure about this sergeant's number?"
He drew a long breath.
"That's Sergeant Manning. Of course, he wouldn't have known he was speaking to a fellow officer." "Not the point, sir, is it?"
"I'm not making excuses for Sergeant Manning, Aidan. I'll make sure someone has a word with him about it. But you need to understand that when you're doing undercover work, you may encounter a different attitude from the police. After all, you're familiar with the situations the uniforms have to deal with in this area. You know the sort of thing that can get served up to them, especially from people with the kind of look you've taken on." Aidan met his eye.
"The look of my skin, you mean, sir?"
"You know that's not what I mean, Aidan." There was an awkward silence, broken by the reappearance of the waiter, with a giant plate on each hand.
"T-bone steak and chips?"
He deposited Aidan's meal in front of him and turned with exaggerated respect to Fletcher.
"And a chicken salad for you, sir."
As Aidan waded into the steak, the chief super picked up a fork and began toying with his coleslaw, showing no signs of appetite.
"I've been taking a look through your reports," he said, "and I'm concerned you're getting too involved in that scene down in the World's End." "No more than I have to be, sir, to pick up on what's making the waves. The way they look, how they behave, those are only the signals they give out. They like to act bad, and they like to act dumb, but actually they got a lot of things worked out."
"Worked out about what?"
Aidan shrugged. "About where they aren't going to fit."
"Nothing new about misfits, Aidan, especially in that age group. Most of them will grow out of it with any luck."
"I reckon that depends,"
Aidan said, cutting around the bone in his steak.
"I reckon that depends on what sort of society they got to fit into." From their point of view, this one doesn't have too much going for it.
He sheared off a piece of meat and held it on his fork.
And I have to say, they've got a point, in certain respects.
Yes, well, Fletcher glanced at his watch. I think we should get your reporting up to date. What's new? As Aidan gave a detailed account of the Highgate show, Fletcher displayed no visible reaction, only making the occasional note in his book.
I took a good look around the area afterwards, Aidan concluded. Collected some samples for forensics, but we need to get a SOCO team up there to do the job properly. I'm a bit concerned about the delay. I was trying to get on to DCI Latham about it, you see, sir.
Yes. Fletcher gave a curt nod and put away the notebook. This habit of wearing masks, how widespread is it?
Well, you don't see them in the street much, but there's a few of those leather hood things worn around the concert places. The Suddens have their own style in masks. That's not a widespread thing at all.
But they might have imitators.
They might. Can't say I've seen any. And they wouldn't be easy to copy, those faces. It's fancy work.
Have you seen one close up? Asked Fletcher. Aidan shook his head.
Only on the stage.
Good. Now my instructions are, you keep your distance from those characters, all right? Your job is just to get names. I want to know exactly who's in this pop group. What are they called?
Sudden Death. Not exactly a pop group, sir. And finding their identities isn't proving all that easy. It's their game to be anonymous.
Is it? Fletcher spoke the words as a statement, not a question. Well, that'll be a test for your skills then, won't it? I want names and descriptions, comings and goings. You can leave the collection of forensic samples to the SOCO team.
As long as they get onto it. That's what's bothering me, see? There's 2 sets of samples I've taken now, with no follow-up at all that I know about.
I'll be deciding what's necessary in that department. You stay on the sidelines. Aidan pushed his plate away. He was getting distinctly narked.
It's not like you can sit back and watch, sir, he said. People pick up on that and they don't like it. So if I'm in this, I'm in it. There's no sidelines to stand on.
If that's the case, said Fletcher, it may be necessary to withdraw you from that situation quite soon. Aidan was taken aback. This was not at all what he'd expected.
But I thought I had an understanding, sir. I had instructions. Commander Macready made it clear to me.
Fletcher met his eye and said slowly, I'm afraid things have taken an unfortunate turn. He stopped and ran the palms of his hands over his face before joining them together in front of him as if he was praying. I understand Steve Latham told you about the attack on Commander Macready?
Happened last Saturday night. Is that right, sir?
Yes. As a consequence, we've made some changes to the management of this case. From now on, you'll be reporting directly to me. This is partly out of consideration for DCI Latham, who was a close colleague of Macready's. There was an awkward pause, and Aidan picked up on the obvious.
Was, sir?
Commander Macready died in hospital this afternoon. Fletcher said the words rapidly, then stopped before adding, I'm sorry to say, this is now a murder investigation, and any prior instructions you had must be set aside due to the increased level of risk. I'd like your assurance that you fully understand what I've said to you. You were to stay on the sidelines. Aidan met his eye and said nothing. Zig pushed her empty plate away and lit a cigarette, while Sharon finished her meal, staring at the television set at the family end of the room. The news was on, and suddenly she left the table to go over for a closer look. She recognised the picture on the screen.
He's dead,
Sharon announced, returning to her seat.
One of the detectives on death row. Somebody killed him.
Zig's attention was taken up by something she was reading, and her reaction was confused. She dropped the book on the floor, scrabbled to pick it up, and came upright again, looking quite flushed.
Who killed him?
I didn't get the whole item, said Sharon. It was nearly finished by the time I picked up on it. All I heard was that he was the victim of an attack at his home and he died in hospital. There was no response, but Sharon noticed that Zig was smoking in a specially jerky way. She was getting to know her friend's odd reactions. She let her alone for a minute, then said straight out, "What's up? You look like somebody's accused you of something." Zig shrugged and drew on the cigarette again. "What's that you were reading?" Sharon had only caught the barest glimpse of the little book, but it seemed to have handwriting in it. Suddenly she twigged and began fishing around in her own bag. "Where's that notebook I found yesterday?" She'd forgotten about it, but evidently Zig hadn't.
I was just checking it out,
said Zig, placing it on the table but keeping a hand over it.
It's not yours anyway. Matter of fact, it belongs to Logan Royce. It's a sort of diary with dates in it.
She opened it and flicked through the pages, then gave a mischievous smile.
Listen to these. It's about you and me at the Chelsea drugstore. The sexy one, who calls herself Zig, gets around in a tight rubber vest, but in spite of the gear, I doubt she even knows what S&M stands for.
Zig snorted.
I wasn't even wearing the rubber vest that day. If I had been, he would have wet himself.
She continued reading.
Her friend Sharon is a runaway kid who has even less idea of what might be stirring down there in the world's end.
Sharon wasn't amused.
I got enough idea of what's going on to know when somebody that's supposed to be my friend is acting like a sneak thief. If you wanted to look at it, why didn't you ask me for it? Sorry.
Zig's mouth had gone a funny shape. She dropped the cigarette on her plate and pressed the heels of her hands into her forehead.
Sorry. That's all.
The apology was awkward, but it sounded genuine. So Sharon decided to lay off the accusations for the time being. "What else does it say?" she asked. Zig turned more pages.
There's a bit he wrote about going up to Highgate on Monday. That's the day before yesterday, isn't it?